The last light bled across Red Willow Basin in shades of copper and rust. Cole Brennan rode the narrow ridge on his bay mare, 38 years carved into weathered skin gray, threading through dark hair at the temples. 3 weeks until retirement papers would end a career built on duty and distance, transforming him into something he couldn't quite picture yet. Smoke caught his attention first. Thin column rising from the basin floor, the kind that spoke of desperation rather than comfort. He'd seen enough campfires to know the difference. This one struggled, barely clinging to life. The collapsed hunting shack came into view as he descended. Roof caved in support beams, twisted canvas sheet torn and flapping. But the fire still burned, smoke rising in that uneven pattern that meant someone had built it without proper fuel or skill. Then he saw the hand, fingers curled slightly pale against dark earth, half hidden beneath a fallen log near the fire's dying light. Cole moved faster, caution giving way to urgency as he pushed aside brush and found her, young Apache woman. Maybe 23, her body twisted from trying to crawl somewhere safe before strength failed. Long black hair tangled with feathers and beads, deerskin dress torn along the ribs where blood had dried in dark lines. But her chest moved, shallow, desperate breasts that barely lifted the blanket someone had thrown over her before leaving her to die alone. Cole knelt beside her, cataloging injuries. The rope burns around her neck stopped his thoughts cold. Deep grooves in the skin, bruising that told him she'd been hanged, left to dangle until her unconsciousness took her. Someone had cut her down afterward, but not out of mercy. The cuts on her ribs, the torn dress, the defensive wounds on her palms. This was punishment meant to destroy more than kill. Her eyes opened when he touched the blanket near her shoulder, and fear erupted across her face with an intensity that made him pull back instinctively. She tried to push herself up, pain shooting through her side and forcing her back down with a gasp she couldn't quite hide. Cole raised both hands slowly, palms forward. His voice came out quieter than he'd spoken in months. "I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't believe him. Why would she? But her body betrayed her pain and blood loss, making choices her mind rejected. When she tried to stand again, her legs folded, and Cole caught her before she hit the ground. She fought him. Weak, ineffective movements, her hands pushing against his chest even as her body went limp from exhaustion. "Let me help you." The words hung between them, her dark eyes searching his face for lies, for the cruelty she'd learned to expect from strangers. Whatever she found there made her fingers loosen on his coat. She didn't pull them back entirely, just stopped fighting. Cole carried her to his horse, wrapped her in his spare blanket mounted behind her to keep her upright against his chest. The line cabin he remembered sat 2 miles north, tucked between rock formations. She needed walls and warmth more than he needed comfort. The cabin door protested when he shoved it open. Inside smelled of old smoke and animal dens, but the structure held. Caught against the left wall table with a warped surface stone hearth still holding ashes. Cole laid her on the cot as gently as his calloused hands allowed. He worked quickly, building a fire that deserved the name, filling a tin bowl with water, tearing strips from the spare shirt in his saddlebag. When he moved the blanket aside to check her injuries, her hands shot out and grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "No wrong touch." The words came out raw, barely more than a whisper, but they carried the weight of someone who'd fought this battle before and lost. Cole didn't pull away from her grip, just met her gaze. "I'm cleaning the wound. That's it." She held on for 3 more heartbeats, every muscle coiled for violence if he crossed the line she'd drawn. Then her fingers loosened, fell away, and she turned her face toward the wall. The cut along her ribs ran deep knife work that came from wanting to hurt without killing outright. He washed the dried blood away with careful pressure, watching her wince each time cold water touched broken skin, her hand gripping the cot edge until her knuckles went white. The rope burns on her neck told their own story. By the time he'd wrapped her ribs, binding them tight enough to stop bleeding, but loose enough to let her breathe, she'd stopped trembling. The fire reached her bones and her body surrendered to exhaustion. "My name is Naira." He'd assumed she was unconscious. The words startled him. She studied him in the firelight, trying to read the man who'd carried her from a dirt to safety. Whoa! Silence stretched between them before her voice came again, curiosity mixed with suspicion. "Why stop for me?" The question hit harder than she probably intended. Why risk himself for a woman he didn't know? He could have ridden past, told himself someone else would find her. "You were hurt. That's reason enough." Something in his face made her believe him at least enough to close her eyes and stop fighting sleep. I'll stay right here. If anyone tries to come in, I'll hear them first. Her breathing found a rhythm that suggested she'd finally let herself rest. Cole remained in the chair, adding wood to the fire when it burned low, listening to every sound outside. Wind through pine branches, distant owl calls, small creatures moving through brush, all normal sounds of night. But he stayed awake anyway, rifle across his lap, mind turning over questions. Who had hurt her badly enough to leave those marks? Why hang her but not kill her outright? The defensive wounds on her hands, the way she'd flinched when he touched the blanket, these weren't marks of random violence. This was personal. Dawn came, slow gray light filtering through gaps in the cabin walls. Cole hadn't slept, hadn't let himself close his eyes. He'd learned that lesson 5 years ago, learned what happened when you let your guard down. The memory of Emma's face hit him like it always did in the quiet hours, sharp and immediate. Her half-Cheyenne features frozen in death, their daughter Sarah small and still beside her. He'd been tracking outlaws that day, doing his job as deputy marshal. He'd come home to their cabin outside Cheyenne and found both of them dead, killed by the men he had been chasing. The territorial marshal had apologized, promised justice. And when those outlaws walked free 6 months later, because some judge decided evidence had been collected improperly, Cole had turned in his badge and started riding, never staying anywhere long enough to build something else someone could take. The door opened without warning. Two Apache women stood in the doorway, both carrying weapons, both frozen in that instant of mutual recognition when everyone realizes their one wrong move from violence. The taller one stood in front, broad-shouldered bone necklace, resting against deerskin dress, her face carved with authority that came from leading rather than following. The other woman, younger, moved with quicker energy, assessing danger with practiced efficiency. Both looked at Naira, first checking the bandages, the way she lay on the cot. Then they looked at Cole, and suspicion hardened their expressions. He lowered the rifle, slowly backing up to give them space. The taller woman's posture shifted slightly, less defensive, but she didn't lower the spear she'd brought. Naira. The wounded woman stirred when she heard voices, her eyes opening halfway. Kiona. The older sister moved to the cot immediately, her hand touching Naira's hair, with gentleness that contrasted sharply with the weapon she still held. She brushed strands away from her sister's face, checking the bandages Cole had tied. Her voice, when she finally spoke, came out controlled but firm. You touch her. The question carried layers. Cole nodded once, keeping his voice steady, only to stop the bleeding. The younger sister circled the cabin's interior, checking corners, studying evidence of what had happened. She saw the water bowl, the torn cloth strips, the carefully tied bandages, the chair positioned beside the cot. Her eyes kept returning to Cole, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. Kiona's expression remained hard as she turned her full attention to Cole. You were alone with her all night. Not a question, but a statement that demanded explanation. Yeah, she was dying, no one else around. Leaving her didn't seem right. The younger sister stopped near the firearms crossing. Many men leave, or do worse. Cole met their gazes. I'm not that kind. Silence filled the cabin, broken only by fire crackle and Naira's shallow breathing. Kiona held his gaze for several seconds, reading him the way she'd probably learned to read men who lied. Whatever she found made her shoulders lower slightly. Naira looked up at Cole, and her voice, though weak, carried conviction. He didn't leave. 3 words that shifted the dynamic in the room, that transformed suspicion towards something approaching the possibility of trust. Kiona's expression recalibrated, adjusting her assessment. She turned fully toward Cole, her posture straightening with formality that suggested ritual tradition older than the territories. She refused marriage. They called her unclaimed. They sent men after her. The pieces began to fit together. Naira's injuries weren't random violence. They were punishment, retribution, for daring to make a choice that someone with power had decided she didn't have the right to make. The younger sister filled in details Kiona's statement had left implied. They want to bring her back. Not for good reason. Cole felt anger tighten his jaw. They close. The younger sister nodded. Not far. They searched last night. That explained the feeling Cole had carried through the darkness. Kiona lowered herself to sit beside Naira, her hand brushing across the blanket. Then she looked at Cole with seriousness that felt like the prelude to something that would bind him. You saved her life. Not gratitude, just fact. Cole waited, sensing there was more. Our law says something for that. A man who keeps a woman alive after she has been cast out becomes her protector. If he wants to marry her, he must first earn approval from her sisters. The words hung in the air. Cole felt something shift in his chest. He hadn't come here looking for obligation, hadn't wanted to be tied to anyone. He'd spent 5 years making sure he never stayed anywhere long enough for connections to form. The younger sister watched him closely, measuring his reaction. You are part of her survival now. That means you stand between her and those who want her. Cole's mind worked through implications. 4 men hunting her, maybe more, and 2 women trying to protect a wounded sister in hostile territory with winter coming. He could leave, collect his horse, ride out, tell himself this wasn't his problem. The image of Emma's face flashed through his mind, the knowledge that she'd died believing he'd abandoned them. If they come, I won't let them take her. The words came out steady, certain. Kiona's expression remained controlled, but something shifted behind her eyes. The younger sister exhaled softly, tension easing. Naira shifted on the cot, looking from them to Cole with confusion. You found me. Her voice came out weak but steady, directed at her sisters. Kiona squeezed her hand gently. We followed signs. You moved far. Cole stepped closer. You need to recover before we move anywhere. The bleeding stopped, but you're not ready to travel. Naira looked at him for a long moment, searching his face. You could leave. Not your fight. I'm not leaving. 3 words that changed everything, that drew a line between the man he'd been and the man he was choosing to become. The cabin went quiet, all 3 women absorbing the finality in his voice. Kiona studied him with renewed intensity, measuring his character. She'd been testing him since she'd walked through the door. But if we're staying here a while, there are things I need to understand. Cole turned to face her directly. Why was she cast out? The 2 sisters exchanged a look. Kiona's jaw tightened. The man chosen for her is older, cruel. He uses fear to keep his place in the council. When she refused, he claimed she disrespected sacred authority. The younger sister stepped forward, bitterness in her voice. He tried to take her by force. She fought back. Cole absorbed that information, feeling the familiar weight of systematic injustice settle across his shoulders. This wasn't exile. It was punishment designed to break her spirit. Rejecting him in front of the council made him look weak. He sent followers to bring her back. The younger sister's voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. Alive or not? Naira flinched, breathing growing uneven. Cole moved to the side of the cot, positioning himself so she could see his face when he spoke. You won't be taken. She raised her eyes, slowly searching his expression for doubt. Cole held her gaze, letting her see the scars on his face, the years of hard living that had taught him which promises he could keep. Kiona stepped closer to her sister. He stands between you and them now. Sacred law binds him. The younger sister spoke with quiet intensity. But sacred law is not something spoken once. It is shown over days. Cole turned his attention to both of them. Then I need to know what your law expects from me. Kiona studied him before responding. Protection is one part, but there are other expectations. The younger sister moved closer. Your past matters. Men who hide their true selves fail quickly. Kiona's question came direct. Who are you, Cole Brennan? The weight of that question settled over him. They weren't asking where he came from. They were asking who he was at his core. Cole pulled a wooden stool toward him and sat, knowing they deserved answers. I was raised on cattle land near the river band. My folks died early. My brother and I ran the place until a raid took him. The memory still stung, but that wasn't the wound they needed to know about. After that, I drifted, worked ranches, fixed things, stayed out of trouble mostly, never stayed anywhere long. Kiona watched him, recognizing the pattern of someone running from something. Why help a woman hunted by armed men? Cole's hand drifted unconsciously to his vest pocket, fingers touching the space where he used to carry a photograph. The motion betrayed him. Kiona's eyes tracked the gesture with understanding. He met her gaze, deciding that if they were going to trust him with their lives, they deserved to know what drove him. Had a wife, half Cheyenne, beautiful, stubborn as hell. Daughter, too. 5 years old, looked just like her mother. Past tense registered immediately. Naira's hand moved slightly on the blanket. Men I was tracking found them. Killed them both, left them in our cabin, where I found them 3 days later. Used their deaths to send message about what happened to lawmen who got too close. The words came out flat, stripped of rage and grief. System failed completely. Marshal's office promised investigation, prosecution, justice. Instead, they walked free 6 months later because some judge decided evidence had been collected improperly. Technical procedures mattered more than truth. Naira's voice came barely above a whisper. You carry grief. Not a question, just an observation. Cole nodded once. The cabin fell into silence that felt different from before, less suspicious, more contemplative. Kiona exchanged a long look with her younger sister, then turned back to Cole with an expression that suggested she'd reached a conclusion. Our father taught us to build signals, quiet signs that only family can read. If we set them around the cabin, we'll know when riders pass. She moved toward the door, gesturing for Cole to follow. This was test and lesson combined. You help build them. Then I'll know if your intentions are real. For the next hour, Kiona taught him how to place markers. Small stacks of stones arranged in patterns. Sticks bent at precise angles pointing toward trails. Lines drawn lightly with charcoal that blended with dead grass. They circled the cabin, marking spots where footprints would be easiest to read, where broken branches would signal passage. As they worked, Kiona spoke quietly, revealing information she'd kept close until now. The man she refused has influence over the council. He wanted her because she is skilled and because she is beautiful. Cole crouched to place another stone marker, his jaw tightening. He took offense when she refused. He claimed she insulted sacred authority. He asked that she be marked as cast out. The man hadn't just been rejected romantically. He'd been publicly embarrassed, his authority questioned by a young woman who dared to assert her own will against his. Cole placed the final marker, then stood. Would he have punished you too? Kiona's eyes hardened. Yes, men like him punish families to break women who resist. They returned to the cabin as morning stretched toward midday. Inside, the younger sister had been tending the fire, boiling water, with herbs creating steam that carried medicinal scents. Naira had pushed herself partially upright, accepting broth her sister offered. The younger sister looked up when they entered. I am Ayasha, healer of our family. Cole nodded. Ayasha moved with confidence. The broth will strengthen her, but she needs days, not hours. Cole moved to the window, checking the markers they'd placed. Everything appeared still peaceful. Kiona joined him at the window. These men move like animals. They don't strike until they smell certainty. Ayasha moved toward them. What do we do? Cole scanned the terrain, his mind working through defensive options. I need to see them before they see us clearly. If I can track who came near the cabin, I'll know their direction, their pace, maybe even how long before they strike. Kiona's posture stiffened. You will not face them alone. If we all go out there, they'll see movement from far off. I'm just one man in a coat. They'll assume I'm a rancher passing through. Ayasha touched her sister's arm. He knows the land as well as we do. Let him read the signs. Kiona hesitated, then gave a single sharp nod. Cole moved toward the door, grabbing his rifle. If they entered the area behind the cabin, they might be circling. I need to know if they split into separate groups. Naira's voice stopped him. Be careful. Cole paused, turning to meet her gaze, seeing genuine worry in her eyes. I will. He stepped outside, immediately shifting into tracking mindset. The ground behind the cabin bore evidence of passage more recent than he'd hoped. Single rider had paused here, horse shifting weight in that distinctive pattern that meant someone had sat in the saddle for several minutes watching. He followed the tracks until they split, one set heading left, another going right. Deliberate divergence that spoke of coordinated movement. They were circling, positioning themselves for assault from multiple angles. Cole moved farther into the brush, following the left track until it reached the creek behind the rock formation. Something caught his attention, a glint of color that didn't belong. He approached carefully. A piece of beadwork lay wedged between stones near the waterline, broken cord suggesting it had been torn loose during movement. Cole pulled it free, studying the pattern. Coarse cord colors that suggested different tribal origins, or maybe just mercenary work. The beadwork meant someone had dismounted, here knelt by the water, spent enough time that personal items could be lost. They'd been closer than comfortable, near enough to study the cabin, to count the horses, to make plans. He pocketed the beadwork and started back toward the cabin, mind already calculating what needed reinforcing, what defensive positions would let them hold against superior numbers. When he reached the cabin, he knocked softly before entering. Kiona opened the door halfway, rifle raised, until she confirmed his identity. What did you see? Cole set the beadwork on the table where all three women could examine it. Ayasha leaned close, her face paling slightly. That's not ours. Cole nodded. They're circling from both sides. At least two riders now, maybe more if they regrouped. Naira's breath tightened, her hand instinctively moving to cover her wounded ribs. They'll drag me back. Cole moved closer to the cot, lowering himself so she could see his face clearly. No one's taking you. Not while I'm breathing. She stared at him, searching for cracks in his confidence. She found only solid resolve. Ayasha sat near the table. These men move carefully. They don't risk open fights. They wait for weakness. Cole picked up the beadwork fragment. They're not here for mercy. Whoever sent them wants to make an example, not retrieve someone peacefully. He glanced at Kiona. You didn't tell me everything. Kiona's jaw tightened. Ayasha made the decision for her, speaking with bluntness. The man she refused is not just older. He holds position over warriors. He wants to replace our father's voice in council. The political dimension hit Cole hard. This wasn't just about a rejected suitor. This was about power, about using Naira's resistance as leverage to undermine her father's authority. If she submits, he claims our family, our lands, our rights. If she dies, he claims justification. The trap became clear. Every outcome served the man hunting them except the one where Naira escaped completely free. Naira trembled, fingers twisting the blanket. I ran so they wouldn't be hurt, but they still came after me. Cole reached for the blanket edge, adjusting it gently around her shoulders. Running didn't place blame on you. His cruelty did. Ayasha's eyes glistened briefly before she turned back to the fire. What do we do now? Cole stood, shifting fully into tactical mode. We prepare. They won't rush until they believe we're vulnerable, so we make sure we're not. He examined the cabin walls, studying sight lines through cracks, calculating fields of fire and blind spots. They'll watch the front first. We'll reinforce the windows with crates. Ayasha blocked the back entrance with the extra boards. Kiona helped me place brush near the trail so we can hear them before they reach the ridge. Naira watched silently, relief mixing with awe as she observed Cole transform from drifter into defender. He wasn't simply helping, he was taking responsibility. As Kiona moved to gather wood, Cole pulled her aside briefly. If things go bad, I'll lead them away. You get your sisters to safety. Kiona stiffened. You would sacrifice yourself. Cole didn't flinch. If it means she lives, yes. Kiona held his gaze for several long seconds, seeing past the surface. Whatever she found changed something behind her eyes. If you fight, she said quietly, we fight too. The afternoon burned away in preparation. Cole and Kiona reinforced vulnerable points, positioned supplies within easy reach, created firing positions. Ayasha worked methodically on Naira's wounds, changing bandages, applying poultices that filled the cabin with sharp medicinal scents. Naira rested against the cot, watching the quiet determination that transformed three strangers into something that approximated family. She saw Cole pause multiple times to check the window, his hand drifting unconsciously to his Colt. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying sounds from the distance, the faint rhythm of hooves moving across rocks, slow and measured. Cole froze at the window, listening with focus that shut out everything except the pattern of movement. Kiona joined him, her hand tightening on the rifle. They've stopped moving. Cole nodded slowly, because they're waiting for darkness. The last light of day began its retreat across Red Willow Basin, pulling shadows longer until they merged into uniform gray that would soon surrender completely to night. The cabin stood silent, a fragile sanctuary against the coming darkness. Cole positioned himself by the front window, rifle resting across his knees. The fire burned lower than he wanted, controlled flame that provided warmth without advertising their presence. Kiona took the rear positions, a spear within reach. Ayasha stayed near Naira, one hand on her sister's shoulder, the other holding a bone-handled blade. The silence outside felt wrong. Not peaceful, but expectant. A branch snapped 50 yards east. Too loud for small animals, too deliberate for wind. Someone had stepped on dead timber, either through carelessness or because they wanted the cabin's occupants to know they were surrounded. Kiona's voice came barely above breath. How many do you hear? Cole closed his eyes, focusing entirely on sound. 3 outside, maybe a fourth farther back, holding horses. Ayasha's grip tightened on her knife. Naira shifted on the cot, trying to push herself more upright. I can fight. The offer came out weak, but the intention behind it carried weight. Cole shook his head gently. You can survive. That's what matters right now. A stone hit the cabin's north wall, not thrown hard enough to damage, but with enough force to announce presence. Cole didn't move, didn't give them the satisfaction of knowing their provocation had landed. Kiona's posture stiffened. They're testing us. Cole nodded slowly. They want us nervous. Mistakes happen when people get scared. Another stone hit the cabin, this time from the western approach. Multiple positions, coordinated timing pressure, designed to feel like it came from everywhere simultaneously. Ayasha moved toward the fire, adding small pieces of wood that would keep it burning without flaring bright. Her hands shook slightly. What happens if they break through? Cole kept his eyes on the darkness beyond the window. Then we make them regret it. The simplicity of his answer somehow steadied everyone. Kiona's shoulders lowered slightly. Ayasha's breathing evened out. A voice cut through the night, male carrying authority that expected compliance. Send out the woman. We'll leave the rest of you alone. Cole recognized the lie immediately. Men who tracked someone for days didn't make deals. Kiona's voice came out sharp. Don't answer them. Cole had no intention of responding. Silence was answer enough. Every second that passed without compliance was statement of intent. The voice came again, closer now, maybe 30 yards. You're protecting someone cast out by her own people. She has no rights under our law. Release her and walk away with honor intact. The appeal to honor almost made Cole laugh, but the attempt revealed something useful. This was the man Naira had refused, the one whose authority depended on breaking her resistance. Ayasha leaned close to her sisters. That's Dakota, the one who tried to force her. The name settled into Cole's memory. Position of authority, council influence. Blood on his hands from this and probably dozens of other situations. Naira's face had gone pale, fear flickering across her features before she forced herself to control it. Her hand found Ayasha's, gripping with strength. He'll kill everyone here. The certainty in her voice came from experience. Cole processed that information, understanding that this had just transformed into fight for survival that ended in blood regardless of who won. A third stone hit the cabin harder this time, demonstrating capacity for violence while maintaining illusion of restraint. Cole stood slowly, moving toward the door with purpose. Kiona rose immediately, positioning herself to block him or support him. What are you doing? Cole checked the Colt at his hip, making it clear we're not negotiating. He opened the door before anyone could argue, stepping into darkness that felt thick enough to taste. The basin spread before him, shadows deep enough to hide armies. His voice carried across the open ground, pitched to reach the men surrounding them without shouting. She stays. Leave now, and we don't have problems. Laughter answered him. Multiple voices, men confident in their numbers and their righteous purpose. Dakota's voice came back closer still. You're outnumbered. You're outmatched. And you're defending a woman who violated sacred tradition. Walk away while you still can. Cole's hand rested near his Colt. No. Single syllable, absolute refusal. Cole heard movement in the darkness, boots shifting position, weapons being checked. He'd just forced their hand, eliminated the middle ground. Dakota's voice changed pitch, anger bleeding through. Then you die defending someone who means nothing to you. Cole considered that statement, tested it against the truth in his chest. She means enough. The words hung in cold air for a moment, that stretched, then shattered, when gunfire erupted from 3 directions simultaneously. Cole dropped flat, rolling left as bullets chewed splinters from the doorframe. He came up, firing the Colt, barking twice toward muzzle flash he'd marked northeast. Behind him in the cabin, Kiona's rifle cracked, once sharp report followed by a yelp of pain. Cole scrambled backward through the door, Kiona slamming it shut the moment he cleared the threshold. Ayasha had pulled Naira down from the cot, both of them pressed against the floor behind the overturned table. The younger sister held her knife ready. The gunfire stopped as suddenly as it started, silence rushing back with ringing quality. Cole checked his ammunition quickly. 6 shots in the Colt, spare ammunition in his belt. Kiona's rifle holding maybe 8 more rounds. Against 4 attackers with unknown ammunition stores, their defensive position looked increasingly untenable. Kiona moved to her position near the rear wall. They'll wait. Make us nervous. then hit hard when they think we're tired. Cole nodded agreement. Naira's voice came from behind the table, weak but determined. How long can we hold? Cole glanced at Kiona. He chose honesty stripped of decoration. Until dawn if we're smart, longer if they make mistakes. And after dawn, the unspoken question. After dawn, the tactical advantage shifted entirely to attackers. Ayasha spoke quietly. She can't run. Even if we wanted to flee, Naira wouldn't survive the attempt. The trap closed tighter. They couldn't surrender. They couldn't run. They could only hold ground and hope something changed. Another sound cut the silence different this time, horses moving through the basin at pace faster than walking. Multiple riders approaching from the south at speed that suggested urgency. Cole froze trying to count animals by sound. Kiona heard it too. Those aren't his horses. The riders emerged from darkness like apparitions, four mounted figures carrying torches that burned bright enough to push back the night. They rode in formation that spoke of military discipline, precision that came from training, and shared purpose. Cole recognized cavalry when he saw it. The lead rider called out voice-carrying authority. Hold your fire! United States cavalry responding to reports of violence against Apache women. Dakota's voice rose from the darkness, smooth transition from hunter to concerned citizen. Marshal, these men are harboring a fugitive. We're retrieving her under tribal authority. The cavalry officer, silver hair visible even in torchlight, reined his horse to position that put him between the cabin and Dakota's hidden position. Tribal authority doesn't include hunting women across federal territory, and from where I'm sitting, this looks more like attempted murder than lawful retrieval. Cole stepped back into the doorway, making himself visible to the cavalry, but keeping the wall close. The officer turned his attention toward the cabin. Who's inside? Cole's voice came steady. 3 Apache women, 1 wounded needs medical attention. We're defending against men who tried to kill her. The officer studied Cole for a long moment. Whatever he found there shifted his expression fractionally. You have a name, Cowboy. Cole Brennan, Deputy Marshal retired. The revelation changed the atmosphere immediately. The officer dismounted. Captain Daniel Harrison, Fort Bowie. We received word that Apache women were being hunted illegally in this sector. Sounds like our intelligence was accurate. Dakota emerged from darkness, finally his features harder than age alone justified. The woman inside violated sacred law. I'm authorized by our council to retrieve her. Harrison's expression didn't change. Your council's authority ends at the reservation boundary. This is federal land, which makes whatever happens here my jurisdiction. The legal technicality hit Dakota like physical blow. Harrison glanced toward the cabin. Why don't we let her tell us what she wants? Cole turned back into the cabin's interior, finding Naira's eyes in the dim firelight. She'd heard everything. Kiona moved beside her sister. You speak your truth. They can't punish you for that. Naira pushed herself upright despite pain determination overriding physical limitation. She moved toward the door with steps that carried every ounce of stubborn will she possessed. Cole positioned himself beside her, ready to catch her if she fell. Naira stepped into the doorway, torchlight catching her face, revealing injuries that told story words could only approximate. Harrison's expression hardened when he saw the rope burns, the bandages, the defensive wounds. Who are you? Naira's voice came out stronger than Cole expected. My name is Naira, daughter of Chief Manaba. I refused marriage to that man. He ordered my death for disobedience. The accusation hung in air. Dakota's face contorted with rage. She lies. She violated sacred obligation. The hanging was punishment approved by council. Harrison's hand moved to his sidearm. Funny thing about approved punishments. They usually come with documentation, witnesses, proper procedure. And from what I'm seeing, this looks more like attempted murder than sanctioned execution. 2 of Harrison's soldiers dismounted, positioning themselves between Dakota and the cabin. The captain pulled folded papers from his coat. I have orders from the territorial governor. Protect Apache women from violence regardless of claimed jurisdiction, which means this woman stays under military protection until proper investigation determines what happened. Dakota's companions emerged from darkness, 3 men who looked more like hired guns than tribal warriors. One of them stepped forward, hand near his gun. We're not leaving without her. Harrison's response came immediate, cold. You draw that weapon and you die. Federal land means federal law. Choose carefully. The standoff crystallized into a moment that could break toward violence or retreat. Kiona appeared in the doorway beside Naira, then Ayasha, three sisters standing together. Harrison saw them clearly absorb the image. Something in his expression suggested this wasn't just professional duty, but personal conviction. He addressed Takoda directly. You and your men are leaving, now. If I see any of you within 5 miles of this cabin before morning, I'm arresting you for attempted murder. Takoda's face twisted with fury, barely controlled. For a long moment, Cole thought he'd make the stupid choice. But calculation won. Takoda turned toward his hired guns, gesturing sharply. This isn't finished. The threat came out quiet, directed at Naira specifically. Then he mounted his horse and rode north into darkness. Harrison watched until he couldn't hear hoofbeats anymore. Then he turned back to the cabin, his expression softening slightly. You ladies need medical attention, Ayasha stepped forward. She needs bandages, medicine for infection, food that's more substantial than what we've been able to provide. Harrison nodded, gesturing to one of his soldiers. He looked at Cole, measuring him again. Deputy Marshal retired. What brings you to Red Willow Basin? Found her dying. Couldn't walk away. Simple truth. Harrison studied him for several more seconds, then nodded once. You made the right choice. The soldier returned with medical supplies. Ayasha immediately began sorting through contents. Harrison gestured toward the south. My men are staying in the area tonight. Make sure Takoda keeps his distance. In the morning, we'll discuss long-term solutions. Naira leaned heavily against Kiona. Her voice came out barely above whisper. Thank you. Harrison's expression remained controlled. Don't thank me yet. What comes next might be harder than what you've already survived. He mounted his horse. Before he rode off, he looked down at Cole one more time. You're good with that rifle. Military could use men like you. Cole shook his head slowly. I'm done wearing badges. Done taking orders. Harrison smiled slightly. Then keep these women safe until we figure out what happens next. He rode into darkness with his men torchlight, fading gradually. Cole stood in the doorway for long minutes after cavalry disappeared, making sure Takoda's group wasn't circling back. Behind him in the cabin, Ayasha worked on Naira's bandages with supplies that were cleaner and more substantial. Kiona moved to check the markers around the perimeter. Naira watched Cole from the cot, her eyes carrying questions she didn't have energy to voice. Cole felt the weight of her gaze but didn't turn. Kiona returned from her perimeter check. Takoda won't stop. He can't afford to let this go. Cole nodded agreement. Then we need somewhere safer, somewhere with people witnesses. Kiona's expression shifted. Our father. If we could reach him, bring him here, or get her to tribal lands under his protection. Ayasha shook her head immediately. Takoda has council influence. Even our father's authority might not be enough. Cole's mind worked through alternatives. What if she requests federal protection formally? Claims political asylum. The suggestion hung in air. Kiona's face hardened with instant rejection. She shouldn't have to abandon her people to stay alive. Cole agreed with the sentiment, but recognized reality. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it might be necessary. Naira spoke finally. I won't live as exile from my own people. The declaration settled over them with finality. Ayasha moved to sit beside her sister. Then we find third option. Kiona looked at Cole, expectation clear. The burden of finding that impossible option somehow became his responsibility. Cole's mind worked through fragments of information, legal frameworks he had operated within as deputy marshal. What if we flip it, instead of Naira seeking protection? What if your father brings charges against Takoda? Attempted murder, abuse of authority crimes federal courts could prosecute regardless of tribal council positions. The suggestion shifted dynamic immediately. Kiona's eyes widened slightly. That would require our father to challenge council publicly. Ayasha added quietly. It could split our people, turn family against family. Naira closed her eyes. I don't want to be reason our people tear themselves apart. Cole moved closer, crouching beside the cot. You're not the reason. Takoda is. Men who abuse authority are the problem, not women who refuse to surrender to that abuse. The words settled into silence. Cole stood, returning to his position by the window. The night stretched ahead, hours of vigilance required before sun provided relief and new complications both. Behind him, the three sisters settled into uneasy rest. Cole kept watch rifle across his knees, turning over problems that had no clean solutions. He'd saved Naira from immediate death, but in doing so had committed himself to navigating systems designed to ensure her eventual destruction. Somewhere in the darkness, Dakota planned his next move. And somewhere in the future that felt increasingly uncertain, Cole would have to choose between the isolation he'd cultivated and the connections forming despite every instinct. But those were tomorrow's problems. Tonight required staying awake, watching shadows, making sure sunrise arrived, with everyone still breathing. The fire burned lower. The wind carried Cole deeper into the cabin through gaps in walls. And Cole kept watch, fulfilling the commitment he'd made, protecting people who'd become his responsibility through series of choices that felt less like decisions and more like gravity, pulling him toward inevitable collision. Dawn arrived with reluctance, gray light seeping through gaps in the cabin walls. Cole hadn't slept, hadn't closed his eyes beyond brief blinks necessary to keep vision clear. His body ran on exhaustion that pushed past physical limits into something closer to autopilot. Kiona had taken a watch rotation near midnight, insisting Cole needed rest even if he refused to acknowledge it, but he'd stayed awake anyway. She hadn't argued, just positioned herself at the opposite window, creating crossfire angles. Ayasha stirred first among the sisters, rising to check Naira's bandages. She pressed fingers against skin, testing for fever, studied breathing patterns with the attention healers develop through experience. Naira woke to that examination, her eyes opening with startled awareness of someone whose last conscious memory involved violence. Ayasha's hand on her shoulder grounded her, pulled her back from panic. Cole stood slowly, joints protesting hours of immobility. He checked the perimeter through visual scan, marking each area where cavalry had positioned themselves overnight. 3 fires burned in the distance, professional spacing that came from soldiers who'd done this work often enough that proper procedure became instinct. Movement near the southern fire drew Cole's attention, a rider approaching at easy pace. As the figure grew clearer, Cole recognized Harrison's silver hair, the captain riding alone with confidence that spoke of trust or calculated risk. Cole moved to the door, stepping outside before Harrison reached the cabin. Morning cold bit through his coat, temperature having dropped during night hours. Harrison dismounted 10 yards from the cabin. He approached with deliberate casualness, hands visible, no weapons drawn. "You look like hell, Brennan." Cole's mouth twitched in something that wasn't quite smile. "Been a long night." Harrison nodded, glancing toward the cabin door. "How's the wounded girl?" "Stable. Healing slower than she'd like. Can't travel for days at minimum." Harrison absorbed that information, tactical implications clearly registering. "That complicates things. My patrol is scheduled to move north by week's end. Can't justify keeping 36 men here indefinitely to guard one cabin." The political reality came through clearly. Harrison had authority short-term, but extended deployment required justification. What about moving her medical wagon, slow travel, whatever it takes to get her somewhere safer? Harrison considered the suggestion. Fort Bowie's medical facilities are adequate, but not equipped for long-term patient care. And bringing her onto federal installation creates its own complications regarding jurisdiction, tribal sovereignty, political implications I'd rather avoid unless absolutely necessary. Before Harrison could continue, Kiona emerged from the cabin, her presence shifting dynamic immediately. Her expression carried controlled anger. "Whatever you're planning, we should hear it. She's our sister, not property to be moved around according to your convenience." Harrison turned toward her, showing no irritation. "You're right. Let's talk inside where everyone can contribute." The 5 of them gathered around the table, Cole and Harrison on one side, the 3 sisters on the other, Naira supported by Ayasha but insisting on sitting upright. The dynamic felt less like negotiation and more like war council. Harrison pulled papers from his coat, spreading them on the scarred table surface. "I've been authorized to offer federal protection under territorial statute that covers political refugees fleeing persecution. If Naira requests asylum claims, credible fear of death, if returned to tribal authority, then military has obligation to provide security until formal hearing can be arranged." Kiona's response came immediate, sharp. "That makes her federal dependent, strips her identity, forces her to abandon her people to survive." Harrison didn't argue, just nodded acknowledgement. "Alternative is tribal resolution. Your father brings charges against Dakota through proper council channels. Internal investigation determines what happened and why." Ayasha leaned forward, her healer's pragmatism cutting through emotional resistance. Our council is divided. Half support Dakota because he brings wealth connections political advantage. Internal investigation becomes political calculation, not pursuit of truth. The problem crystallized. Authority that claimed legitimacy through tradition could be corrupted by the same mechanisms that should ensure fairness. Cole spoke for the first time since entering the cabin. What do you want, Naira, not what's tactical or politically smart? What do you actually want? The question hung in air, all eyes turning toward the wounded woman. Naira's hand trembled slightly on the table before deliberately relaxing. When she spoke, her voice carried clarity. I want Dakota to answer for what he did. Not just to me, but to other women he's hurt, other people he's crushed, using authority he was given to protect, not destroy. I want my people to see him for what he is. The declaration transformed conversation, completely shifting from defensive posturing toward offensive strategy. Harrison's expression shifted through surprise towards something that might become respect. That's ambitious. Requires evidence, witnesses willing to testify, political will to prosecute someone with the kind of influence Dakota wields. Kiona's voice carried edge. Our father would testify. He knows what Dakota did, how council authority was perverted to enable attempted murder. If federal investigation is what's required to force accountability, then he'd cooperate. Ayasha added quickly, we have witnesses. People who saw what happened, who know. Dakota ordered the hanging. They're afraid to speak now, but if investigation had federal backing, if protection was offered, Harrison held up his hands, slowing the enthusiasm. I can provide initial protection. Can't promise long-term security for multiple witnesses, can't guarantee federal prosecution will actually happen, even if evidence supports it. Territorial politics are complicated. Cole understood what Harrison wasn't saying directly, how systems failed people who needed them most. His voice came out harder than he'd intended. So we gather evidence, convince witnesses to risk themselves testifying, rely on military protection that might vanish when political winds shift, and hope federal prosecutors decide Apache women murdered by powerful men is case worth their time. Harrison met his gaze, not flinching. Yeah, that's about the size of it. System's broken, Brennan. You know that as well as I do. But it's the system we have, and sometimes broken tools are better than no tools at all. The cabin fell silent. Naira's voice broke the silence, steady despite exhaustion. I'll testify. I'll tell what happened, name every person involved. And if that destroys me politically, socially, within my own community, at least I'll have tried. Kiona's hand found her sister's, gripping with affection and worry both. She looked at Harrison. What happens after she testifies? If Dakota's arrested, his allies will target our family. We'll need protection extending beyond the trial. Harrison's expression suggested he'd anticipated this question. I can't promise indefinite protection, but if your father cooperates, if testimony is credible, and evidence supports prosecution, then military has interest in making sure witnesses survive to trial. That buys time. Cole's mind was already moving past immediate crisis. What if we don't wait for federal investigation? What if we bring charges directly to territorial court, civilian jurisdiction that bypasses tribal authority but doesn't require military prosecution? Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. Kiona leaned forward, confusion evident. Can we do that? Cole nodded. Attempted murder on federal land falls under territorial criminal statutes. If we can prove the attack happened where we're sitting, establish this cabin as being on public territory rather than reservation land, then civilian courts have jurisdiction regardless of Dakota's tribal position. The strategy shifted political calculations significantly. Harrison's expression showed he was running through implications. You'd need evidence placing Dakota at the scene, witnesses connecting him to the attack, physical proof that establishes attempted murder. Ayasha spoke quietly. We're witnesses. We saw the rope burns, saw her injuries, found her where Dakota's men left her to die. Cole added, building momentum. And I cut her down, found her still breathing barely. That's independent witness with no tribal affiliation, no political stake. Deputy Marshal with federal law enforcement background testifying that Apache woman was hanged and left for dead on public land. Harrison sat back, expression shifting through calculation towards something approaching approval. Territorial court in this district is in Tucson. 3 days ride, maybe 4 if you're moving slowly with wounded patient. Dakota has that much time to eliminate witnesses, intimidate testimony, make evidence disappear. The tactical problem loomed large. Kiona's voice carried determination. Then we move fast, tonight when Dakota doesn't expect it. Use darkness to create distance. Cole shook his head immediately. She can't handle hard riding. Not with wounds this fresh. Ayasha confirmed his assessment. She needs another 3 days minimum, preferably 5. Rushing recovery risks infection, internal damage complications that could prove fatal. The conversation circled back to fundamental problem need for immediate action, conflicting with medical reality. Every hour they delayed gave Dakota opportunity to plan. Harrison stood gathering the papers. I'll keep patrol here another 5 days. That gives your sister time to heal enough for travel. But after 5 days, we move regardless of readiness. Can't justify longer deployment. 5 days felt simultaneously too long and not nearly enough. The sisters exchanged looks, silent communication passing between them. Naira spoke for all of them. 5 days. We'll be ready. Harrison nodded once, then turned toward the door. Cole followed him outside. Morning had progressed toward afternoon sun climbing higher. The captain moved toward his horse, checking saddle automatically. He paused before mounting. You know what you're getting into here. This isn't just protecting women until cavalry shows up. You're involving yourself in tribal politics, territorial, jurisdictional disputes, criminal prosecution of powerful man. Cole understood the warning. I know. Doing it anyway. Harrison studied him for several seconds. You're going to need more than my patrol for this. Need local allies, people in Tucson, who can smooth jurisdictional complications. The captain continued before Cole could respond. Judge Marcus Weatherby handles most territorial criminal cases in Tucson. Former Army lawyer understands jurisdictional complexity, won't be intimidated by tribal council pressure. You get proper evidence to him, he'll hear the case. Cole absorbed the information. Harrison wasn't finished. And there's a woman, Elena Martinez, runs boarding house near courthouse, known for helping people who need safe shelter during trials. She's protected witnesses before. The pieces fell into place, creating picture of infrastructure that could support prosecution effort. But none of this addressed underlying question Cole needed answered. Why are you doing this? You said yourself military can't justify extended involvement. Could walk away, file report, and avoid complications that might damage your career. Harrison's expression hardened briefly, anger flashing before control reasserted itself. Because I've seen this before. Powerful men using authority to abuse people who can't fight back, systems designed to protect the vulnerable being perverted to enable violence. I'm tired of filing reports that go nowhere, tired of watching injustice happen because intervention is politically inconvenient. The honesty surprised Cole. They stood in shared silence for a moment, two men who'd seen enough of how systems failed. Harrison mounted his horse. Before he rode off, he looked down at Cole one more time. That woman in there, Naira. She's braver than most men I've served with. Don't let her courage go to waste. Cole nodded. Harrison turned his horse and rode back toward cavalry positions. Inside the cabin, voices rose in discussion, the sisters debating strategy and risk. Cole remained outside for several more minutes, scanning perimeter, letting his mind work through what needed to happen during the 5 days Harrison had purchased. The sound of approaching hooves pulled his attention north. Single rider moving at pace that suggested purpose. Cole's hand drifted to his Colt before conscious thought confirmed identity. The rider emerged from tree line, older Apache man sitting his horse with bearing that spoke of authority earned through years of leadership. Even at distance, Cole recognized significance of his arrival, the way his clothing carried traditional markers indicating high status. The rider approached without hesitation, his eyes moving from Cole to the cabin to the cavalry positions visible in the distance. When he reined his horse to stop, his gaze settled on Cole with intensity that felt like judgment. I am Chief Manaba. I believe you have my daughter inside that cabin. The voice carried weight that transcended volume, authority that came from decades of leadership. Cole met his gaze. Cole Brennan, found her 3 days ago, half dead from hanging, been protecting her since. Manaba's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Emotion he controlled too well to let show openly. Relief that she'd survived. Dakota's men did this. Under his orders, using council authority, he claimed to legitimize attempted murder. The statement came out flat, not question, but confirmation. The chief dismounted with fluid grace, moving toward the cabin with purpose. Cole stepped aside. This wasn't his conversation to moderate. The door opened before Manaba reached it, Kiona appearing with expression that cycled through surprise and relief. Father, you came. Did you think I wouldn't? Kiona stepped back, letting her father enter, Cole following after appropriate interval. Inside, Naira had pushed herself as upright as injuries allowed. Manaba crossed the cabin in 3 quick strides, his arms wrapping around her carefully. The embrace lasted longer than comfortable, watching time, Cole and the other sisters looking away. When Manaba finally pulled back, his voice came thick with emotion he no longer tried to hide. I should have stopped this sooner. Should have challenged Dakota before it reached this point. Naira shook her head, tears streaming. You couldn't have known. He hid his intentions behind council protocols. Ayasha moved close in her hand, finding her father's arm. Dakota won't stop, even with cavalry protection, even with witnesses willing to testify. Manaba straightened, wiping his face, chief's authority reasserting itself. When he looked at Cole, his expression had transformed into something harder. Captain Harrison briefed me before I rode here. Said you're planning territorial court prosecution, civilian jurisdiction, to bypass tribal authority that Dakota controls. Cole nodded, appreciating that Harrison had coordinated with Manaba. That's the plan. If you're willing to testify, provide context about how Dakota perverted council authority. Manaba's jaw tightened. My testimony carries risks extending beyond immediate case. Half the council supports Dakota, views him as necessary ally. If I testify against him, I fracture unity we've built over decades. Kiona's voice came sharp, anger overriding political calculation. So we protect unity by sacrificing women who resist powerful men. Manaba turned toward his eldest daughter, his expression carrying pain. I'm not saying we sacrifice anyone. I'm saying actions have consequences that ripple beyond immediate situation, that my testimony will be seen as chief aligning with federal authority against tribal sovereignty. The political complexity crystallized. Cole had been trying to navigate this trap of jurisdictions and authorities. Prosecuting Dakota through territorial courts meant inviting federal intervention into tribal affairs. But not prosecuting him meant accepting that tribal authority could be perverted to enable murder. Ayasha spoke into the heavy silence. Naira can't return to the reservation. Even if Dakota is somehow constrained politically, his allies will find ways to eliminate her. She needs protection extending beyond this cabin. The choice clarified into binary decision. Manaba looked at each of his daughters in turn, reading their expressions, understanding they'd already made their choice. His eyes finally settled on Naira. What do you want, daughter, not what's politically wise or tactically sound? What does your heart say should happen next? The question echoed what Cole had asked earlier. Naira's hand trembled on the blanket. I want him to answer. Want council members who supported him to understand they enabled attempted murder. And I want other women to see that fighting back is possible. The declaration settled over the cabin with weight that felt almost physical. Manaba closed his eyes briefly, the gesture suggesting prayer or resignation. When he opened them again, his expression had hardened into resolve. Then I'll testify. We'll provide whatever context territorial court requires to understand how Dakota corrupted council authority. Kiona moved to embrace her father, relief evident. Ayasha joined them, 3 generations standing together. Cole remained near the window watching the reunion, but not participating. His role had clarified tactical support and protection rather than political strategist. Manaba separated from his daughters, turning back to Cole. Captain Harrison said you were deputy marshal. That means you understand how territorial courts function, what evidence they require. Cole nodded. Evidence is straightforward. Rope burns, knife wounds, defensive injuries, all documented by Ayasha's treatment in my initial assessment. Testimony from witnesses, including me, Kiona, Ayasha. Manabai absorbed the assessment. I can provide additional witnesses. Council members who were present when Dakota made initial accusations against Naira. Their testimony won't directly prove he ordered the hanging, but it establishes pattern of hostility. The case strengthened with each piece added, but Cole's tactical mind kept returning to most vulnerable moment, the journey to Tucson. We need to talk about the journey. 3 days minimum travel time, probably 4 given Naira's condition. Multiple opportunities for ambush. Kiona moved toward the table, her tactical sense engaging. What if we don't go directly to Tucson, take roundabout route, make it harder to predict where we'll be? Ayasha immediately identified the flaw. Longer route means more days traveling, more time before Naira receives proper medical care. Cole had learned that sometimes the best strategy was the obvious one. Direct route, fast as Naira can handle, cavalry escort concentrated rather than spread thin. We push through dangerous sections with maximum speed. Manaba nodded agreement. I'll ride with you. My presence might give Dakota pause. Kiona's voice came sharp. If he's willing to order my sister's death, he won't hesitate to eliminate you. Manaba's response carried weight of certainty. Dakota wants my position, not my death. Killing Chief creates different political dynamic than murdering cast-out woman. He'll avoid direct confrontation if possible, focus efforts on isolating Naira. The assessment rang true. Dakota's strategy would focus on eliminating Naira quietly while preserving plausible deniability. Planning continued through the afternoon, details accumulating into comprehensive strategy. Harrison returned before sunset, contributing military perspective and confirming cavalry escort would accompany them entire journey. By the time darkness fell again, they had plan that felt achievable, if not entirely safe. Timeline established that balanced Naira's healing needs against urgency of reaching Tucson before Dakota could consolidate opposition. Cole stood at his now familiar position by the window, watching night reclaim the basin. Behind him, Manaba sat with his daughters, conversation flowing in their own language. Harrison's cavalry maintained their perimeter. 5 days until they moved. 5 days to prepare to heal, to gather final pieces of evidence. Cole's thoughts drifted to Emma and Sarah, to the justice that had been denied him 5 years ago. This case was different, but the fundamental pattern remained: same powerful people using authority to harm vulnerable ones. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe territorial court would prove more reliable. Maybe justice was actually achievable if enough people refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Or maybe they were riding toward failure, but at least they were fighting. At least Naira wouldn't die silent and alone. Cole kept watch through the night, rifle across his lap, mind turning over details that would matter when they finally left the cabin's relative safety. The second morning after Manaba's arrival brought changes Cole registered immediately. Naira's breathing came easier, the shallow gasp replaced by something closer to normal rhythm. Color had returned to her face. Ayasha changed the bandages with practiced efficiency, unwrapping layers of cloth to examine wounds that had begun slow transformation from open injuries toward closed tissue. The healer's expression showed cautious satisfaction. Naira endured the examination with gritted teeth, pain evident despite improvements. When Ayasha finally finished rewrapping the wounds, Naira sagged back against the cot. Cole watched from his position near the window, noting details that would affect travel calculations. 4 more days until departure, assuming nothing deteriorated. Manaba had spent most of the previous day riding between the cabin and cavalry positions, coordinating with Harrison, establishing communication protocols. The chief understood military logistics better than Cole had expected. Kiona worked outside with 2 of Harrison's soldiers reinforcing the markers around the perimeter. Her movements carried controlled fury energy, finding outlet in physical labor. The cabin door opened, Manaba entering. With expression that immediately told Cole something had changed, some new development that would complicate planning. "We have a problem." The words dropped into cabin's interior like stones into still water. Manaba moved to the table, not sitting, standing, in way that suggested he wouldn't be staying long. Dakota sent message through intermediary, claims he wants to negotiate peaceful resolution, offers to withdraw accusations against Naira if she agrees to exile from reservation permanently, rather than pursuing territorial prosecution. Kiona's response came immediate, sharp rejection. It's a trap. He wants her isolated away from witnesses and protection where he can eliminate her quietly. Manaba nodded agreement. I agree, it's likely trap, but we need to understand what he's actually proposing. Cole stepped away from the window. He's worried. Otherwise, he wouldn't be offering anything, would just wait for opportunity to strike. Ayasha looked up from her position beside Naira. What makes him worried? He still has council support, still has authority to act. What's changed? The question hung in air before Manaba provided answer. Federal investigation has been formally initiated. Territorial Governor's Office received complaint about attempted murder on federal land assigned investigator, who's apparently known for being thorough and difficult to intimidate. The revelation shifted everything. Dakota's leverage had evaporated the moment bureaucracy engaged. Cole felt something loosen in his chest, tension easing. But the offer of negotiation also revealed Dakota's desperation. Negotiated exile would achieve his primary objective while avoiding federal prosecution. Naira's voice came weak but clear. What happens if I accept, take exile and abandon, pursuit of justice, disappear somewhere he can pretend I don't exist? Manaba turned toward his daughter, carrying pain from knowing answer. Then Dakota wins. He eliminates threat to his authority, establishes precedent that powerful men can order murders and escape consequences by offering exile to survivors. The brutal honesty settled over Cabin like physical weight. Kiona returned from outside in time to hear her father's assessment. We don't negotiate with men who order our deaths. We pursue prosecution through every available channel. The absolutism should have felt reckless, but something in her delivery carried conviction that transcended simple vengeance toward principle worth defending. Cole recognized the sentiment. He'd felt similar certainty 5 years ago when Emma and Sarah's killers had walked free. He'd walked away, instead started drifting. But watching Kiona's fierce determination, seeing Naira's willingness to risk everything, something in him shifted. Maybe systems could be forced to work properly. Maybe sufficient pressure applied consistently could overcome institutional inertia. Manaba's voice interrupted Cole's thoughts. I'll send message declining the offer. But that means Dakota knows negotiation failed, knows federal investigation is proceeding, knows he's running out of options. The implication was clear. Rejecting Dakota's offer would likely trigger escalation. The next few days before departure would be most dangerous. Harrison needs to know. Cavalry positions might need adjustment. Manaba nodded, moving toward the door. Before he left, he turned back to address everyone. No one touches my daughter while I'm breathing. Dakota can send his hired guns, can leverage every political connection he possesses, won't matter. We protect her until testimony reaches court. The declaration should have felt melodramatic, but something in Manaba's delivery transformed the words into vow that carried weight beyond simple promise. After he left, silence filled the cabin. Ayasha returned to organizing medical supplies, her hands moving with increased urgency. Naira shifted on the cot, trying to sit more upright. Her eyes found Cole's across the cabin. Why does this matter to you? My father has reasons. I'm his daughter. My sisters have obligations. We're family. Harrison has duty. He's military officer. But you're just passing through, found me by accident. The question wasn't new variations having been asked before, but something in this version carried weight. Previous inquiries had lacked. Cole considered deflecting, offering comfortable lie. But Naira's gaze held steady, suggesting she'd accept silence but would recognize avoidance. His hand drifted to his vest pocket, touching the space where Emma's photograph had once rested. The motion betrayed him. When he spoke, his voice came rougher than intended. Had a wife, half Cheyenne, beautiful, stubborn as hell. Daughter, too. 5 years old, looked just like her mother. Past tense registered immediately. Naira's hand moved slightly on the blanket. Men I was tracking found them. Killed them both. Used their deaths to send message about what happened to lawmen who got too close. The words came out flat, emotionless. System failed completely. Marshal's office promised investigation, prosecution, justice. Instead, they walked free 6 months later because some judge decided evidence had been collected improperly. Naira absorbed his story, connecting dots between his past and present actions. I'm sorry that happened to you. Simple words, but something in her delivery carried genuine empathy. Cole nodded acknowledgement. Ayasha spoke into the silence. You're trying to save her because you couldn't save them. That's understandable. But vengeance against past isn't same as justice in present. Make sure you're clear about which one you're pursuing. The distinction cut deeper than Ayasha probably intended. Was he protecting Naira because it was right thing to do, or because substituting her survival for Emma's death somehow balanced scales that could never actually be balanced? Before he could formulate response, the door burst open and Kiona entered, at near run, her expression carrying alarm. Rider approaching from the north, not military, not tribal. Looks like hired gun coming fast, like he's being chased. Cole grabbed his rifle and moved to the door in single fluid motion, positioning himself where he could see the approaching threat while maintaining cover. Kiona followed close behind. The rider emerged from treeline at full gallop horse, lathered with sweat, man hunched forward in a way that spoke of injury or exhaustion. As he drew closer, Cole could see blood on his coat fresh enough that it hadn't dried wound in his side that he clutched with one hand. Behind him, perhaps 200 yards back, three more riders appeared pursuing with determination. The lead pursuer raised rifle firing shot that went wide, but clearly intended to bring down the fleeing man. Harrison's cavalry reacted immediately, soldiers mounting up and riding to intercept the pursuit rifles ready, but not yet firing. The fleeing rider saw the cabin and turned toward it with desperate urgency. Cole moved forward to meet him, rifle up but not aimed. The rider pulled his horse to sliding, stopped 10 feet from the cabin, nearly falling from saddle before catching himself. The words came out in gasps. Counsel witness was going to testify for Dakota. He sent men to kill me when he found out I changed my mind. The revelation hit like physical blow. This man had been part of Dakota's support network council member, who'd apparently planned to provide testimony backing whatever false narrative had been constructed. But something had changed. Manaba appeared from where he'd been speaking with Harrison, his expression cycling through surprise toward recognition. Karuk, why are you here instead of standing with Dakota? The wounded man Karuk slid from his saddle with assistance from two cavalry soldiers. His hand pressed against his side, blood seeping between fingers. Because I have daughter too. And when I saw what Dakota ordered done to yours, when I understood that my support enabled man who would murder young woman, I couldn't be part of that anymore. The confession came out raw, just honest acknowledgement of complicity and decision to stop being complicit. Kuruk's gaze found Naira standing in the cabin doorway. I'm sorry, won't pretend that makes difference. But I can testify about council meetings where Dakota discussed how to eliminate. You can provide evidence of premeditation. Harrison arrived with main cavalry group, his soldiers forming defensive perimeter, as the three pursuers pulled up short, apparently reassessing their approach. The lead pursuer shouted across the distance, "That man is wanted for betraying council confidences. Surrender him to tribal justice." Harrison's response came cold. The man you were attempting to kill is now under federal protection as witness in active investigation. Leave now or be arrested for attempted murder on federal land. The standoff crystallized. Three hired guns facing 24 cavalry soldiers. The lead pursuer's expression showed he was running calculations. After the moment that stretched, he turned his horse and gestured to his companions. Retreat that preserved lives but announced clear message about Dakota's desperation. As they disappeared, Cole felt tactics shift fundamentally. They'd gone from protecting single witness towards safeguarding multiple people whose testimony would create comprehensive case. But they'd also acquired another wounded patient who needed immediate medical attention, another person whose mobility limitations would complicate travel. Ayasha had already moved to examine Kuruk's wound. The knife cut was deep but clean, missing vital organs, but causing enough blood loss that he needed treatment quickly. Inside the cabin, Naira watched through the doorway as her father helped Kuruk toward shelter. Her expression carried complexity, anger and satisfaction, vindication that more people were recognizing Dakota's cruelty. Manaba paused beside his daughter before following Kuruk inside. This changes everything. Kuruk's testimony will prove conspiracy will demonstrate that Dakota's actions weren't isolated incident, but pattern of behavior. The expanded scope should have felt like victory. But Cole's tactical mind recognized it also multiplied dangers they faced. Harrison joined Cole outside after ensuring his soldiers maintained defensive positions. This is good for prosecution, but bad for immediate security. Dakota's going to be desperate now. We need to accelerate timeline move before he can organize comprehensive response. Cole understood the logic, but medical reality created hard constraints. What about splitting them? Send Kuruk ahead with smaller escort, while main group follows with Naira. Harrison considered the suggestion, then shook his head. Splitting our force makes both groups weaker. Dakota attacks whichever target looks more vulnerable. We stay together, present, unified front. The reasoning made sense even as it trapped them. Kiona approached from where she'd been checking perimeter markers. We're sitting targets, defending fixed position against enemy who knows exactly where we are. This is wrong. We should be moving. Everything she said was true, but truth didn't change reality. Cole started to explain medical constraints again, but stopped when he saw Ayasha emerge from cabin with expression that immediately indicated new complication. Naira's wound is infected. Not badly yet, early stages, but needs treatment beyond what I can provide with current supplies. She needs antibiotics, clean environment, medical expertise I don't possess. The revelation shattered planning they'd been building. Infection could kill faster than Dakota's hired guns. They needed real medical facility. Fort Bowie has medical officer, 2 days ride closer than Tucson, military protection during treatment. Harrison's suggestion made tactical sense but introduced new political complications that Manaba immediately identified. Bringing her onto military installation creates perception of federal custody. His allies will claim military kidnapped her. The legal minefield spread before them. But before anyone could propose alternatives, Karuk appeared in the doorway supported by Manaba. Dakota's planning major assault. Overheard him coordinating with hired guns before I fled, gathering force of 20 men to attack within next 2 days. He's not trying to eliminate you quietly anymore. He's committing to direct confrontation. 20 men. The number hit like physical blow. Harrison's expression showed he was running numbers. We can defend the cabin against 20, but casualties will be significant, and if Dakota's willing to sacrifice that many men, he might succeed through sheer attrition. Cole's mind raced through alternatives. We need to leave. Tonight, before Dakota's force assembles. Ayasha's protest came immediate. Naira can't travel, not with infection starting. Moving her now risks turning manageable infection into life-threatening sepsis. The impossible choice crystallized. Stay and face assault by superior numbers. Or leave immediately with patients who weren't medically cleared. Risk killing them through journey their bodies couldn't handle. Either option led toward death. Naira's voice cut through the argument. I'll risk the journey. Rather die trying to reach court than die waiting in cabin for Dakota's men to murder everyone who tried to protect me. The declaration should have been reckless, but something in her delivery transcended simple bravado. Manaba moved beside his daughter. If we leave tonight, we abandon defensive positions, move into open territory where Dakota's forces can intercept us anywhere. Harrison's tactical mind engaged with the challenge. Unless we don't go to Fort Bowie, unless we create false trail suggesting that destination while we actually hourly ride south toward smaller settlements with minimal medical facilities. The misdirection strategy appealed to Cole's experience. Kiona stepped forward. I can create false trail, take 3 cavalry soldiers, ride hard toward Fort Bowie, leave signs suggesting main group is following. Meanwhile, actual group goes south through canyon routes, reach settlement of San Rafael in 2 days if we push hard. Ayasha immediately identified medical implications. San Rafael has missionary clinic. Basic facilities, probably no antibiotics, but clean environment in someone with medical training. The pieces were assembling into strategy that felt achievable despite remaining extremely dangerous. Cole felt momentum building, but one critical element remained unaddressed. Can Naira and Karuk survive 2-day hard ride to San Rafael? Ayasha's expression showed she was running calculations she didn't want to make. Maybe. If infection doesn't accelerate during travel, if wounds don't reopen, if their bodies can handle stress. But I can't promise they'll survive, can only say that staying guarantees their deaths when Dakota attacks. The acknowledgement settled over everyone. Naira had already made her decision. Kuruk, despite being new to their group, apparently recognized his choices had narrowed to identical binary. Harrison began issuing orders to his soldiers, preparations for immediate departure. Kiona moved to gather supplies. Cole returned to the cabin to help Naira prepare for travel she wasn't ready for. She was attempting to stand without assistance, a determination overriding pain. He moved beside her, offering his arm for support she initially resisted before practical necessity overcame pride. Her weight against him felt insubstantial. When she looked up at him, her eyes carried mixture of gratitude and fear. Thank you. For everything. For not leaving when you could have, for standing against people whose conflicts weren't yours, for risking yourself to protect someone you didn't know. Cole shook his head, uncomfortable with gratitude that felt undeserved. Haven't gotten you to safety yet. Don't thank me until you're testifying in court and Dakota's facing judge. Outside, Harrison's cavalry had assembled into traveling formation, soldiers distributing themselves to create defensive perimeter. Kiona returned from her supply gathering. Manaba helped Kuruk mount one of the spare horses. The sun had begun its descent toward horizon afternoon, stretching toward evening. Cole checked his weapons systematically ritual that grounded him before action. Naira emerged from cabin with Ayasha's support moving slowly but under her own power. She caught Cole's eye across the gathering, some unspoken communication passing between them. Harrison mounted his horse, taking position at the head of formation. We ride hard until full dark, then continue at slower pace. No fires tonight, minimal conversation, weapons ready. Our goal is distance, not confrontation. Questions? Silence answered him. Kiona mounted alongside 3 cavalry soldiers who'd volunteered to create false trail, her expression showing no fear despite accepting the most dangerous role. Before they separated, Naira called out to her sister, "Be careful. Can't lose you too." Kiona's response came with fierce certainty. "You won't. I'm too stubborn to die serving Dakota's purposes." Then she rode north with her small group hoofbeats fading. Harrison watched them go before turning his attention back to main formation. The journey south began without ceremony, just disciplined military movement through terrain that would grow increasingly difficult as light failed. Cole rode near Naira, close enough to assist if she faltered. As the cabin disappeared behind them, Cole felt familiar weight settling across his shoulders, the weight of responsibility he'd accepted without fully understanding its implications. But at least they were moving. At least they were refusing to wait passively for destruction. At least they were fighting. Darkness gathered as they rode, stars emerging one by one overhead. And somewhere behind them, Dakota was gathering his forces for assault on cabin that would be empty when he arrived. The night stretched ahead full of dangers they couldn't predict. But they rode anyway, choice-made path committed to consequences, accepted as price of refusing to surrender. The first hours of riding passed in tense silence, broken only by hoofbeats and occasional whispered commands from Harrison adjusting formation. Cole kept his attention divided between terrain ahead and Naira beside him, watching for signs her condition was deteriorating faster than Ayasha had predicted. Naira swayed in her saddle after the first mile, her body protesting movement it wasn't ready for. But she didn't ask to stop, didn't voice complaints, just gripped her horse's mane with white-knuckled determination. Kuruk rode in similar condition, several horses back, his wound seeping blood through hastily applied bandages, his face pale enough that moonlight made him appear ghostly. But like Naira, he maintained position without protest. The canyon Harrison had chosen for their southern route narrowed as they progressed, walls rising steep on both sides, limiting visibility, and creating natural choke points where ambush would be devastating. But the restricted terrain also meant their tracks would be harder to distinguish from natural patterns. Harrison called the first halt after 2 hours' brief pause to rest horses and check that wounded passengers were still functional. Ayasha moved immediately to Naira, checking bandages, pressing fingers against skin, testing for fever. Her expression showed concern, but not alarm. Cole dismounted, stretching muscles that had grown stiff from tension-filled riding, scanning the canyon walls above them for movement. Nothing stirred except wind through sparse vegetation, night sounds of small animals conducting normal business. Manaba approached, his weathered face showing strain. "She's holding better than I expected." The chief nodded, something like pride mixing with paternal concern. "She gets that from her mother. Woman who could endure anything when she believed cause was worth the suffering. Died during winter raid 15 years ago fighting to protect our youngest children." The revelation added context Cole hadn't possessed. Manaba's expression carried shadow of old grief. "We'll keep her safe. Get her to San Rafael, to Tucson, to wherever she needs to testify." Manaba studied him for a moment. "You believe that? That kind of conviction is dangerous because it makes you take risks rationalist men would avoid, but it's also necessary because rational assessment says we should have surrendered already." Cole understood the observation. Sometimes irrational is all that's left when rational approaches lead to same outcome as giving up. Before Manaba could respond, Harrison approached with expression that signaled new complication. "Scouts report movement 3 miles north. Could be Kiona's group executing false trail strategy, could be Dakota's advanced scouts. Either way, we need to assume hostile forces are closer than we'd hoped." The news compressed their margin of safety. Cole's mind ran through tactical implications. How long until they reach the cabin? Until they discover we've fled? Harrison's answer came with certainty. My estimate is they hit the cabin within 2 hours. Takes another hour to realize we're gone and organize pursuit. So 3 hours before active hunt begins, maybe four if we're lucky. 3 hours. The window felt impossibly narrow. Cole calculated distances, the pace they could maintain with wounded riders. Can we reach San Rafael before they catch us? The question hung unanswered for several seconds. Depends on factors outside our control. If infection stays manageable, if horses hold up, if terrain doesn't force detours maybe, but it's going to be close. Ayasha had finished examining both patients. They can continue, but not much longer at this pace. Naira's infection is stable, but I can see early signs of fever developing. Kurok's wound keeps reopening with the riding motion. The assessment confirmed what Cole had suspected. They were attempting the barely possible and hoping luck would bridge gap between capability and necessity. We ride until we can't anymore, until horses collapse or patients lose consciousness or pursuit catches us. His voice came out harder than intended. Naira heard the shift in tone from her position near the horses, her eyes finding his, across the gathered group, something passing between them. The halt ended, everyone remounting with movements that carried increased urgency. Cole helped Naira into her saddle, feeling her body tremble with exhaustion. They resumed their southern progress at pace slightly faster than before, accepting that harder riding risked medical complications in exchange for distance. The canyon narrowed, further walls closing until passage felt claustrophobic, single-file formation required. Cole's instincts screamed that this was perfect ambush location, but Harrison's scouts had checked ahead, reported the route clear, and they had no viable alternative. The passage opened gradually into wider valley relief, palpable as formation spread from vulnerable single file. Moon hung low on horizon now, providing minimal light that would fade completely within the hour. Naira's voice came quiet beside Cole. What happens if we don't make it, if Dakota catches us before San Rafael? The question deserved honest answer. Then we fight. Make them pay high enough price that some of his men survived to tell a story about how many people they killed, how much force was required to silence people trying to testify. The pragmatic assessment of their potential deaths as tactical assets felt grim but realistic. Naira absorbed his response in silence. I don't want to be martyr. Want to live long enough to see Dakota face judge. Her voice carried intensity that transcended personal survival. Cole understood the sentiment. He'd felt similar determination 5 years ago. Before he could formulate response, a sound cut through the night that froze everyone instantly. Rifle shot, distant but clear, coming from the direction they'd traveled. Single report followed by silence. Harrison raised his hand, entire formation halting. Could be Kiona's group engaging advanced scouts. Could be Dakota's forces discovering cabin empty. Either way means pursuit is active and closer than we estimated. Manaba's jaw tightened, fear for his eldest daughter evident, despite practiced control. He started to turn his horse north. Cole's hand moved to his rifle. We keep moving. Trust that Kiona knows what she's doing. The words felt inadequate. Manaba held his position for a moment that stretched, visible struggle between paternal instinct and leadership responsibility. Finally, he nodded one sharp gesture. The formation resumed movement, pace accelerating beyond what medical caution recommended. Distance had become more valuable than preserving patient comfort. Naira swayed in her saddle more noticeably than before, fever apparently developing faster than Ayasha's earlier assessment had predicted. Her eyes had taken on glassy quality. Ayasha noticed simultaneously with Cole, both of them moving to flank Naira, ready to catch her if she fell. Fever is spiking, not critical yet, but trending that direction. She needs antibiotics I don't have, rest her body isn't getting. Cole's voice came tight. How long hours, days? What's realistic time frame before infection becomes life-threatening? Ayasha's response came with honesty that felt more brutal than intended. 12 hours, maybe 18 if her constitution is stronger than I'm giving credit for. After that point, even proper medical intervention might not save her. 12 hours. Cole calculated distances, travel time. The math suggested they could make it barely if nothing went wrong. But nothing had gone according to plan since he'd found Naira 3 days ago. Assuming smooth execution felt like dangerous delusion. Harrison moved his horse alongside Cole's, voice dropping to level that wouldn't carry. Scouts are reporting more movement behind us. Multiple groups, coordinated search pattern. Dakotas committed significant resources to this hunt. The tactical situation was deteriorating faster than their position improved. Cole felt familiar sensation of walls closing in. Can we fight them off if they catch us before San Rafael? Harrison's expression provided answer before words did. Depends on where they catch us. Open ground, we're finished. Canyon or defensible position, maybe we last long enough for something to change. Every path forward led through violence and loss. Cole had faced similar circumstances before, situations where tactical assessment suggested surrender was only rational choice, but something deeper refused to accept defeat. Dawn began its slow arrival as they emerged from canyon into more open terrain, gray light that revealed landscape features while simultaneously eliminating darkness that had provided concealment. Within the hour, they'd be fully visible to anyone tracking them. Kuruk had fallen farther behind during the night, his horse slowing as the wounded rider's control degraded. Two cavalry soldiers had positioned themselves beside him, ready to catch him if he fell. The rifle shot came without warning, crack of sound that shattered morning quiet. Second shot followed immediately, then third. Pattern suggesting shooter or shooters positioned on ridge to the east. Harrison's voice cut through the chaos. Defensive formation, protect the wounded cavalry, return fire. We're not stopping. We're shooting to suppress while we move through kill zone. Soldiers responded with precision rifles rising toward the eastern ridge. Formation compressed around Naira and Kuruk. Human shields created by bodies of men committed to protecting witnesses. Cole fired twice toward muzzle flashes he'd marked contributing to suppressive fire. His mind was already calculating next steps. This was advanced scouts rather than main force harassers meant to slow them down and report position. More shots came from different angles. Second group of attackers positioned south of their position crossfire that eliminated easy escape routes. One cavalry horse went down, bullet catching it in the shoulder, animal screaming, while rider rolled clear. Naira's horse bolted, fear overriding training, carrying her away from formation toward open ground. Cole spurred his own mount without conscious thought, closing distance with speed that felt reckless but necessary. He caught her horse's bridle after pursuit that covered 50 yards in seconds, yanking hard to slow the animal's panicked flight. Naira slumped in her saddle, barely conscious, fever and shock combining to strip away awareness. Back to the formation, hard riding that felt like retreating. Bullets cut air around them close enough that Cole felt displacement. One round caught his coat sleeve, tearing fabric but missing skin. They rejoined the defensive cluster as Harrison organized fighting withdrawal, disciplined retreat that maintained coherent formation. The captain's strategy became clear. Enemy forces were fixing them in place, slowing progress while main pursuit group closed distance. We need to break contact completely. Find terrain that forces them to lose sight of us. Harrison nodded agreement. He pointed toward a line of heavy vegetation visible perhaps a mile south. That tree line. We reach it, split into two groups, make them choose which trail to follow. The strategy offered possibility of escape if executed properly, but required maintaining pace that Naira and Karuk couldn't sustain indefinitely. Cole glanced at Naira, slumped against her horse's neck, semi-conscious at best. He made decision he didn't have authority to make. I'll stay with Naira. Smaller group, harder to track, can move slower and focus on keeping her alive. Manaba's protest came immediate. You can't protect her alone against Dakota's forces. Cole met the chief's gaze. Smaller group is harder to track, can use terrain in ways formation of 20 can't. And if Dakota's forces follow the main group, we slip through while they're committed elsewhere. Harrison intervened before Manaba could continue objecting. He's right. Main formation draws pursuit. Smaller group might slip through if they're careful and lucky. Ayasha had been listening while checking Naira's condition. I go with them. Naira needs someone who can treat infection, keep her alive long enough to reach San Rafael. The addition made sense, despite further dividing their defensive capability. Manaba looked from his daughter to the healer to Cole. His response when it came felt like surrender rather than agreement. Keep her alive, whatever it takes. Bring her to San Rafael and I'll find you there. Cole nodded once. The formation split as they reached the tree line, main group continuing south with Harrison leading, taking Karuk and majority of cavalry soldiers. Cole veered east with Naira and Ayasha entering heavy vegetation at different points. Behind them, gunfire resumed as Dakota's advanced scouts tried to fix main formation before it escaped. But Harrison's soldiers held together, returning fire that forced attackers back. Cole guided his horse through dense forest at pace that balanced speed against need for stealth. Naira rode with minimal awareness, her body moving automatically. Ayasha followed close, her eyes constantly scanning Naira's condition. The healer's presence reassured Cole even as it added complexity to protection responsibilities. The forest thickened as they penetrated deeper sunlight, filtering through canopy in fragments that created shifting patterns of light and shadow. Cole kept mental map of their general direction, ensuring they were still trending toward San Rafael. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by sounds of movement through undergrowth. Behind them, distant sounds of gunfire suggested Harrison's group was still engaged. Naira's condition deteriorated as morning stretched toward afternoon, fever visible in flushed skin and labored breathing. Ayasha called halt, finally medical necessity overriding tactical caution. They stopped in small clearing where water flowed through natural spring. Cole dismounted and caught Naira as she slumped from saddle consciousness, having departed entirely now. Ayasha worked with practiced efficiency, unwrapping bandages that had become soaked with fluid infection, produced cleaning wounds with water that was cold and clean, but lacked antiseptic properties. Her expression showed concentration rather than panic. Cole maintained perimeter watch, rifle ready, eyes scanning treeline. His mind kept returning to sound of gunfire they'd heard earlier, wondering if Harrison's formation had managed to break contact. The sun climbed higher, heat beginning to build. Cole calculated remaining miles, estimated travel time with patient who was barely alive. Recognized that their chances of arriving before sunset were minimal. Ayasha finished her emergency treatment, rewrapping wounds with clean cloth. She has maybe 6 hours. Could be less if infection accelerates. After that, even proper medical treatment probably fails. 6 hours to cover distance that should take 8 under ideal conditions with patient who couldn't ride unassisted. The math felt impossible, but Cole had learned 5 years ago that impossible situations sometimes yielded to people stubborn enough to refuse accepting defeat. He'd been too late to save Emma and Sarah, but he wasn't too late for Naira. Not yet. We ride now, fast as her body can handle, faster if necessary. Ayasha helped lift Naira back into saddle, unconscious woman secured with rope that would keep her from falling. The healer mounted her own horse. They rode south again, leaving the clearing behind, resuming flight. Cole pushed his horse harder than he liked, aware he was asking animal to perform beyond what was reasonable, but recognizing that gentle consideration mattered less than human life. The forest began to thin after an hour of hard riding, trees giving way to more open terrain. Cole weighed the trade-off, speed gained versus visibility lost, deciding that time pressure made exposure acceptable risk. Behind them, no sounds of pursuit reached them, either because Takota's forces had committed fully to chasing main formation or because their trail had been sufficiently obscure. The settlement of San Rafael appeared on horizon as the afternoon stretched toward evening, cluster of buildings that felt impossibly welcome. But distance remained deceptive, mile or two that would take precious time to cover. Cole urged his horse faster, aware he was risking the animal's collapse, but unable to moderate pace when destination was visible and patient was dying. Ayasha matched his speed, her own urgency overriding healer's instinct toward caution. They entered San Rafael at near gallop hooves, raising dust on the main street, drawing attention from residents who emerged to see what urgency was driving these desperate riders. Cole scanned buildings, looking for anything that resembled medical facilities, settling on structure with cross painted above the door. He dismounted before his horse fully stopped moving to catch Naira as he cut ropes that had held her upright. Her body felt hot with fever that had progressed beyond anything Ayasha's field treatment could address. A woman emerged from the building bearing the cross, middle-aged, with gray threading through dark hair clothing that marked her as religious order. Her eyes took in scene immediately. Inside. Now. I need to see what I'm working with before I can determine if she's salvageable. The clinical assessment should have felt cold, but something in the woman's tone suggested she cared despite professional distance. Cole carried Naira inside, following directions to examination room that smelled of herbs and carbolic acid. The woman worked with practiced efficiency, cutting away bandages, examining wounds with attention that suggested she'd seen infection before. When she looked up finally, her expression carried gravity. Infection is severe. Blood poisoning has started, which means we're racing against systemic failure. I can try, can give her everything I have, but outcome is uncertain at best. The honesty felt brutal but necessary. Cole stepped back, letting the healer work finding position near window where he could watch street outside. The missionary healer who'd introduced herself as Sister Catherine worked through the night with determination that transcended professional obligation. She'd explained that she'd come to San Rafael 15 years ago after watching her own sister die from infection that proper medical intervention could have prevented. Cole understood the motivation, people trying to redeem past failures through present actions. Near midnight, Naira's fever broke suddenly, temperature dropping with speed that Sister Catherine said was encouraging but not conclusive. The healer's expression showed cautious optimism. Ayasha had fallen asleep in chair near the examination room door. Cole remained awake, unable to surrender consciousness despite his body's protests. Sister Catherine emerged from the examination room near dawn, wiping hands on cloth stained with blood and medicinal compounds. She'll live. Infection is responding to treatment, fever has stabilized, vital signs are improving. She needs rest, continued antibiotics monitoring, but I believe we've passed the crisis point. The words should have brought relief. Cole felt only numbness, exhaustion that had moved past physical tiredness. Ayasha woke when Sister Catherine spoke, her healer's instincts pulling her from sleep to waking alertness within seconds. Can she travel? Not immediately, but in days rather than weeks. Sister Catherine considered the question with professional care. 3 days minimum. 5 would be better. She needs time for antibiotics to fully address infection. The timeline created new tactical problems. 3 to 5 days in San Rafael, meaning Dakota's forces would have opportunity to locate them. Cole moved to the window overlooking Main Street, dawnlight revealing San Rafael awakening to new day. His mind was already calculating defensive positions, escape routes. The sound of approaching horses pulled his attention, fully alert. But tension eased when he recognized Harrison's silver-haired cavalry captain leading formation of soldiers who looked as exhausted as Cole felt. Manaba rode beside Harrison, the chief's expression showing relief when he saw Cole in the window. The formation pulled to halt outside the missionary clinic. Cole stepped outside before they could enter. Harrison met him with expression that cycled through relief toward grim assessment. We broke contact with pursuit 6 hours ago. Cost us 3 soldiers wounded, 2 horses killed, but we made them pay heavily enough that Dakota's forces pulled back to regroup. The tactical updates suggested they'd bought time, but not safety. Manaba stepped forward before Harrison could continue, paternal concern overriding strategic discussion. Naira. Cole's response came with honesty that felt more valuable than comfortable reassurance. She'll live. Sister Catherine believes infection is under control, but she needs days of rest before she can travel. Relief flooded Manaba's expression. Harrison's voice cut through the moment of reprieve. Dakota knows we're heading to San Rafael or somewhere in this direction. His forces will search every settlement within reasonable travel distance, which means we probably have 48 hours before hostile contact resumes. The math created impossible situation. Medical necessity requiring 3 to 5 days conflicting with tactical reality that provided perhaps 2 days. Sister Catherine had listened from the doorway. When she spoke, her voice carried certainty that transcended fear or risk assessment. She stays here until medically cleared to travel. I don't care what threats are approaching. My clinic provides sanctuary to anyone who needs healing, and I won't compromise that principle. The declaration should have felt naive, but something in Sister Catherine's delivery suggested she'd faced down threats before. Manaba studied the missionary with expression that showed respect mixing with concern. Your sanctuary won't stop Dakota if he decides eliminating Naira matters more than respecting religious neutrality. He's already ordered her death once. Sister Catherine's expression didn't change. Then we'll pray his conscience stops him where religious symbols don't. But regardless, the girl stays until she's medically cleared. The standoff between practical tactics and absolute principle created tension that couldn't be resolved. Harrison intervened. We'll defend this location for 48 hours while Naira receives initial treatment. If Dakota's forces haven't arrived by then, we reassess. If they do arrive, we fight here. The compromise satisfied no one completely, but represented best available option. Sister Catherine nodded acceptance, returning inside. Cole remained outside as others dispersed to their assigned tasks. Manaba approached after ensuring his soldiers were positioned properly. You've protected my daughter through circumstances that should have killed her several times over. I need to understand why. The question felt like attack disguised as inquiry, but something in Manaba's tone suggested genuine confusion rather than accusation. Cole considered deflecting again, but Manaba had trusted him with his daughter's life, deserved honesty. His hand moved to vest pocket again, unconscious gesture. Manaba's eyes tracked the movement. Had a family once, wife and daughter. 5 years ago, men killed them while I was away doing job I thought mattered more than staying home where I was needed. System failed to deliver just as killers walked free because procedures were valued over truth. The confession came out rougher than intended. Manaba absorbed the information in silence, his expression showing understanding. So you saved my daughter because you couldn't save yours. You're trying to balance scales that can never be balanced. The assessment cut deep, exposing exactly what Cole had been avoiding. But before Cole could formulate defense or acknowledgement, Ayasha emerged from the clinic with expression that immediately shifted everyone's attention. She's awake, asking for you specifically. The last part was directed at Cole. He felt similar confusion mixed with apprehension. He entered the examination room to find Naira propped against pillows, her face still pale, but carrying awareness that had been absent during crisis hours. You stayed through everything. Why? The question echoed Manaba's inquiry, but something in Naira's delivery felt different, less demanding, and more genuinely curious. Cole moved to chair beside her, bed sitting with weariness that transcended physical exhaustion. Because you deserved someone who wouldn't leave. Because systems that should have protected you failed completely, and walking away would have made me complicit in that failure. Naira absorbed his response in silence. You are not responsible for what happened to them, to your family. Being away when tragedy struck doesn't make you guilty of failing to prevent it. The absolution should have felt presumptuous, but something in her delivery transcended presumption toward genuine attempt to release him from burden. Before Cole could respond, the sound of distant gunfire shattered the morning quiet. Rifles firing in pattern that suggested organized assault. Cole was moving before conscious thought engaged, positioning himself between Naira and the window. Ayasha rushed in moments later, her expression carrying controlled fear. Harrison's voice carried from outside orders delivered with calm that imposed discipline. They will not take her. Not from this place, not while I'm breathing. Sister Catherine appeared in the doorway with expression that showed anger rather than fear. Cole checked his rifle, confirming ammunition that felt inadequate for extended engagement. Manaba entered the clinic with blood on his coat, minor wound that hadn't slowed him. Dakota came himself, leading the assault personally, risking capture or death because eliminating you matters more than his safety. The information shifted tactical assessment significantly. This wasn't simple elimination of witnesses, but personal vendetta. The gunfire outside intensified concentrated barrage that suggested attackers had finished probing and committed to serious assault. Harrison's soldiers returned fire with disciplined bursts. Cole moved to window that offered view of Main Street where most of fighting was concentrated, seeing Dakota's forces advancing with coordination that suggested military training. He counted approximately 15 attackers visible. A window shattered on far side of clinic glass, exploding inward. Sister Catherine moved without hesitation, positioning herself near the breach with medical bag ready. Ayasha had armed herself with knife from medical supplies. Manaba took position near the doorway, rifle up, ready to kill anyone who attempted entry. The assault wave crested suddenly, attackers rushing forward with covering fire. Close combat erupted in brutal intensity, rifles giving way to pistols and knives. Cole fired through the broken window, controlled shots that dropped one attacker and wounded another. His mind calculated ammunition remaining, estimated how long they could sustain this intensity. One of Dakota's men reached the clinic door, shouldering through with violence. Manaba killed him before the weapon fully aimed point-blank shot that sent attacker backward in spray of blood. But more attackers followed immediately. Sister Catherine went down, blood blossoming on her shoulder where bullet had caught her. Cole shifted his aim, killed the second man through doorway, wounded the third seriously. The doorway choked with bodies, now bottleneck that gave defenders temporary advantage. Harrison's voice carried from outside, rallying his soldiers, orchestrating counterattack. The intensity of gunfire shifted as cavalry soldiers advanced. The gunfire began to slacken after minutes that felt like hours intensity dropping as Dakota's forces pulled back. Wounded cried out on both sides. Cole maintained his position at the window, watching as attackers retreated toward positions where they'd staged initially. Harrison entered the clinic with expression that showed satisfaction, mixing with grim awareness of costs. We held, killed maybe 8 of theirs, wounded more. But we lost 5 soldiers dead, another 6 wounded, and they're regrouping now, not retreating, which means second assault is coming. The tactical update confirmed what Cole had suspected. First assault had been test rather than full commitment. Dakota's forces remained operational, still outnumbered defenders. Manaba moved to where Sister Catherine sat against wall, her shoulder bandaged hastily by Ayasha. The chief's expression carried respect. Sister Catherine looked up at him. She stays. Treatment continues. My sanctuary means something, or it means nothing. The words should have felt naive after assault that had nearly breached defenses. But something in Sister Catherine's delivery transformed stubbornness into dignity. Outside, the afternoon sun burned toward evening. Cole understood Harrison's defensive preparations would have to adapt that night. Fighting required different tactics. Ayasha finished treating Sister Catherine, returning to check on Naira, whose condition had apparently remained stable despite violence. The healer's expression showed cautious approval. But time was exactly what they didn't have. Cole felt familiar weight settling across his shoulders. Manaba approached him near the window. If they break through, if defenses collapse and retreat becomes necessary, will you stay with my daughter? The question demanded honesty. Cole considered lying, but something in Manaba's gaze suggested the chief would recognize dishonesty. I'll stay. Whatever happens, she reaches Tucson and testifies, or we both die trying. The vow hung between them. Manaba nodded once, then returned to his position. And Cole remained at the window, watching shadows lengthen across San Rafael, waiting for second assault that would determine whether justice was achievable or merely comfortable fiction. Darkness came with finality. Cole's eyes adjusted gradually to reduced visibility, learning to distinguish shapes from shadows. Harrison had repositioned his remaining soldiers to account for casualties in tactical vulnerabilities darkness created. Inside the clinic, Ayasha had extinguished all lights that might provide targeting reference. Sister Catherine remained conscious despite her wound, whispering prayers that carried through the quiet. Naira had slipped back into exhausted sleep. Cole envied her that escape. The first indication of renewed assault came not from sound, but from absence of its sudden quiet that felt wrong. Cole's hand tightened on his rifle. Movement flickered at edge of visibility, shapes darker than surrounding darkness. Cole fired toward the movement-controlled shot that wasn't aimed to kill, but to announce defenders were alert. Other defenders followed his lead, rifles cracking in pattern that established perimeter defense. But the assault wave kept coming, using darkness to advance between defensive positions. One attacker reached the clinic's side wall undetected, placing explosive charge that detonated with concussion that shook the building. Harrison's response came immediate, shifting defenders toward the breach. Cole moved toward the breach with Manaba, both recognizing this was the point where defense would succeed or fail. They positioned themselves on either side of the blown wall. The next attacker through came fast. Cole's shot caught him mid-roll. Second attacker followed immediately. Manaba took that one with precision, but third and fourth attackers came together, overwhelming defense through numbers, forcing Cole and Manaba to fall back. Interior fighting erupted with intimate brutality. Cole found himself grappling with man whose face he couldn't clearly see, hands finding throat and squeezing. The attacker went limp. Cole rolled away, searching for next enemy, finding Manaba engaged with 2 opponents. Cole shot one of Manaba's attackers from behind. The chief dispatched his remaining opponent with efficiency. Ayasha's scream cut through the chaos. Cole moved that direction without conscious thought, finding an attacker who'd broken through toward where Naira lay. The man had Ayasha by the throat, knife raised. Cole's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him away. Before Cole could fire finishing shot, Dakota's voice cut through the combat. Stop! All of you stop fighting now. The words should have been meaningless. But something in Dakota's delivery transcended desperation toward calculated offer. Harrison's voice responded before anyone else could. You're losing. Pull back now and maybe some of your mess survive. Dakota's response came with confidence that felt wrong. I have 3 of your scouts. Captured them an hour ago. They're alive currently, will remain that way if you surrender Naira and withdraw. Continue fighting and I execute them immediately. The revelation hit like physical blow. Harrison's expression showed he was calculating rapidly. Cole's mind raced through implications. Dakota's offer was designed to create exactly this paralysis. Manaba spoke before Harrison could respond. You claim to hold hostages. Prove it. Smart play buying time while forcing Dakota to demonstrate credibility. Silence followed long enough that Cole began to think the chief's assessment was correct. Then a voice cut through the darkness, young cavalry soldier speaking with controlled fear. Captain Harrison, this is Private Marcus Chen. They have us bound about 50 yards north. Two others with me, both wounded, but alive. He's not bluffing, sir. The confirmation eliminated hope. Harrison's expression showed he was processing decision no commanding officer wanted to make. Before the captain could respond, Naira's voice came from the examination room with strength that shouldn't have been possible. Let me go. Trade me for the hostages. I can't be reason more people die. The offer carried nobility that felt simultaneously admirable and unacceptable. Cole's response came before anyone else could speak. No, surrendering you means Dakota wins means every person who died protecting you died for nothing. His voice came out harder than intended. Dakota's voice returned. You have until count of 10 to send her out. After that first hostage dies. Then second 90 seconds later. Then third. And then we resume assault. The ultimatum crystallized situation into stark binary. Harrison's face showed he was calculating possibilities, searching for third option. But Cole saw what the captain apparently couldn't. The only way to resolve hostage situation without surrendering Naira was to eliminate Dakota before he could issue execution orders. Cole turned to Manaba, meeting the chief's eyes across darkened interior. Some unspoken communication passed between them. The chief nodded one sharp gesture. Manaba moved toward the breach with movements that carried deliberate casualness, positioning himself where he could observe Dakota's location. Cole checked his rifle, confirming load. Harrison apparently recognized what was being planned, his expression shifting through calculation toward grim acceptance. The captain moved to window that would give Cole firing position. Dakota's voice resumed the count. 5, 4, 3. Cole aimed towards source of voice darkness, making precision impossible but general direction sufficient for attempt. Everything compressed into moment that felt suspended outside normal time. 2. The shot broke night silence with crack that seemed louder than it should have. The bullet traveled distance and time too short to measure. Dakota's voice cut off mid-word number 1, dying unspoken, replaced by sound of body hitting ground with heavy finality. Silence followed long enough that Cole began to think perhaps the shot had missed. Then chaos erupted among attacking forces. Confusion as leadership vacuum created cascade of uncertainty. Some voices called for retreat, others insisted on continuing attack. Harrison seized the moment immediately. Your leader is dead. You're fighting for man who can no longer pay you. Surrender now and face territorial court that might show leniency. Continue fighting and we kill all of you. The offer created new calculus for attackers. With Dakota dead with threat of federal prosecution, continuing the assault served no one's interests. Voices rose in debate among attacking forces. Minutes passed in tense standoff. Finally, a voice emerged with authority that suggested second in command. We're withdrawing, but we're taking our wounded and dead. You try to stop us, we resume fighting. Harrison accepted the terms immediately. Take your casualties and go, but understand that federal marshals are coming, that territorial court has jurisdiction over everyone involved. The warning established that withdrawal wasn't amnesty. Whether attackers believed the threat or simply needed face-saving justification, they began moving away. Cole remained at his firing position for long minutes after sounds of retreat faded, completely unable to quite believe that assault had ended. But silence deepened, without violence resuming. Harrison sent scouts to confirm retreat was genuine. They returned with reports that enemy forces had indeed withdrawn. Inside the clinic, reaction to Dakota's death progressed through stages of disbelief toward cautious acceptance. Sister Catherine had remained conscious throughout. Ayasha moved immediately to treat defenders' wounds. Casualties had been significant, 5 more soldiers dead and 3 wounded seriously. Manaba had taken minor wounds that he dismissed. He moved to examination room where Naira had remained throughout. Cole finally lowered his rifle after confirming scouts' reports. Exhaustion hit him with crushing weight. But mixed with exhaustion and relief came something else, guilt. He'd killed men before, but something about assassination shot felt different. Harrison approached with expression that showed he was processing similar reaction. That was good shooting, difficult shot in darkness. You saved lives tonight. The words should have felt like absolution, but something in Harrison's delivery suggested the captain was trying to convince himself as much as provide reassurance. Before Cole could formulate response, Naira appeared in the doorway with Ayasha supporting her. Her eyes found Cole's immediately. You killed him, ended his life to protect mine, to prevent executions, to preserve possibility of justice, that his death ironically makes less achievable. The observation cut deep, exposing exactly the contradiction Cole had been avoiding. Dakota's death had undermined strategic objective of bringing him before court. But dead men also couldn't order more killings, couldn't continue corrupting systems they controlled. Cole met Naira's gaze without flinching. He was going to kill hostages, was going to resume assault that would have killed you and probably everyone defending this clinic. I made calculation that his death was worth preventing those outcomes, but I can't tell you whether that calculation was right or wrong. Naira absorbed his response in silence. After a long moment, she nodded with something that might have been acceptance. Manaba joined them. Dakota is dead. His corrupting influence has been removed from council. Whether this achieves justice, as courts would define it, matters less than whether his death makes our people safer. The pragmatic assessment offered different framework. Cole found limited comfort, but recognized its logic. Harrison had been coordinating with his remaining soldiers. When he returned, his expression carried mixture of relief and renewed concern. Dakota's death will create power vacuum in Apache Council, and his followers who withdrew tonight will report what happened, which means territorial authorities will want explanations. The captain's assessment introduced complications Cole hadn't fully considered. Federal marshals would investigate, but those were tomorrow's problems. For now, survival felt sufficient. Sister Catherine called for Ayasha's assistance. The two women worked together to treat wounded. Cole found position near window now empty, except for bodies that hadn't been retrieved. The settlement would recover, residents would return to routines. But for people gathered in this clinic, recovery would be more complicated. They'd killed people tonight, had made impossible choices, had survived through combination of skill and luck and willingness to do violence. Whether they'd been right or wrong, whether justice had been served or compromised, these questions would be answered by others through processes they couldn't control. Naira moved beside him at the window. What happens now? With Dakota dead with assault repelled, what do we do with survival? We've fought so hard to achieve. Cole considered the question seriously. We testify. We take what we've learned, what we've served, what we've lost, and we make it mean something by ensuring the truth reaches people who can use it to prevent similar abuses. The answer felt inadequate, but sometimes inadequate answers were all that existed. Naira nodded slowly. Her hand found his on the windowsill touch that carried multiple meanings: gratitude, solidarity, shared recognition of what they'd survived together. They stood together, watching dawn begin its slow arrival light that would reveal full extent of damage. But dawn also meant surviving through the night. Harrison joined them with the expression that suggested he'd spent remaining night hours coordinating. We leave tomorrow. Naira needs another day of treatment, and we need time to bury dead and stabilize wounded for transport. The timeline created new tactical problems. Better to reach Tucson first, establish themselves as witnesses under court protection. Manaba had overheard Harrison's planning, moving to join discussion. Council will demand accounting, investigation into how their member died. They'll want someone to blame. The warning introduced new complication, but those concerns would have to be addressed later. For now, exhaustion demanded rest that had been denied too long. Sister Catherine had finished treating most urgent casualties. Cole found position near examination room, exhaustion finally overwhelming resistance to sleep. His eyes closed despite efforts to maintain vigilance. But before sleep claimed him completely, he felt a hand touch his shoulder gently, Naira's voice coming quiet and close. Thank you for everything. Whatever happens next, I want you to know your choices mattered. The gratitude should have felt uncomfortable. His response came without conscious filtering. You deserve someone who wouldn't leave. Still do. Whatever comes next, I'm seeing this through. Sleep claimed him, finally pulling him down into darkness that felt safer than waking consciousness. And around him, other survivors found similar rest exhaustion, overcoming trauma temporarily. Outside San Rafael stirred toward new day, and the survivors moved forward toward destinies that remained uncertain, despite having survived circumstances that should have destroyed them. 3 days passed in San Rafael before Sister Catherine declared Naira stable enough for travel. 3 days that felt simultaneously too short and interminable time that allowed physical recovery while psychological wounds remained raw. The settlement had absorbed the violence with resilience that frontier communities develop through necessity, residents returning to routines while carefully avoiding discussion of what had occurred. Bodies had been buried, both defenders and attackers receiving simple graves in ground that didn't distinguish between righteousness and corruption. Harrison used the time to coordinate with federal authorities, telegraph messages exchanged with territorial governor's office, and marshal service. The captain's diplomatic efforts created official narrative about brave civilians and military personnel defending federal witnesses against unlawful attack, framing that positioned them as victims rather than potential subjects of investigation. Cole spent the days preparing for final journey, checking weapons and supplies, calculating routes that would minimize exposure. But physical preparation occupied only a fraction of his attention, remainder consumed by processing what had happened during assault, what Dakota's death meant for justice they'd been pursuing. Naira recovered faster than Sister Catherine's cautious prognosis had predicted, her constitution apparently stronger than circumstances suggested. She spent hours in quiet conversation with her sisters, processing trauma and grief, rebuilding connections that crisis had strained. On the morning of departure, residents gathered to watch formation prepare for movement, silent witnesses whose presence felt like acknowledgement of significance. Sister Catherine stood among them, her wounded shoulder bandaged, but her bearing suggesting she'd already forgiven the disruption violence had caused to her mission. Harrison had organized the column with the attention to security that previous experience had taught him was necessary. But intelligence suggested Dakota's followers had dispersed after their leader's death, organizational structure having collapsed without authority figure who'd held it together. The journey to Tucson began without ceremony formation, departing San Rafael as sun climbed toward midday. Cole rode near Naira, close enough to assist if medical complications emerged, but respecting distance that allowed her dignity. They traveled for 2 days without incident, terrain that had felt hostile during desperate flight, now seeming almost peaceful. Naira spoke with Cole during hours of riding discussions that ranged from practical concerns about testimony to deeper questions about what they'd experienced. She asked about Emma and Sarah on second evening direct inquiry that bypassed polite avoidance. Cole found himself answering with honesty that surprised him, describing his wife's fierce independence and his daughter's infectious curiosity, memories he'd been avoiding for 5 years suddenly accessible. In return, she shared stories about her mother who'd died defending children, about growing up with sisters who'd protected her, about refusing Dakota, not from simple defiance but from recognition that surrendering autonomy would destroy something fundamental about who she was. The conversations built connection that transcended protector and protected towards something more, mutual recognition of shared humanity that crisis had forced them to acknowledge. Tucson appeared on horizon during that afternoon of third-day territorial capital that represented civilization and bureaucracy and legal structures they'd been fighting to reach. The settlement sprawled larger than Cole remembered, growth that reflected territory's expansion. Harrison led formation directly to federal courthouse, imposing stone building that dominated Central Plaza. Soldiers stationed outside recognized Harrison's uniform, admitting group without challenge. Inside, clerk directed them toward the chambers of Judge Marcus Weatherby, territorial magistrate Harrison had identified as official, most likely to hear case properly. The judge proved to be man in his 60s, former Army lawyer, whose bearing suggested he understood both military necessity and legal principle. Weatherby listened to abbreviated summary of events, his expression cycling through surprise toward grim determination. When Harrison finished initial briefing, Judge turned attention to Naira with directness that suggested he wanted her perspective. Tell me what happened. Start from beginning and include everything relevant. Don't omit details because you think they make you look bad or complicate prosecution. Naira delivered testimony with clarity that suggested she'd been preparing mentally for this moment, organizing experiences into narrative that conveyed both facts and emotional reality. She described Dakota's initial advances, her refusal, his escalating pressure that culminated in hanging that should have killed her. Cole found himself mentioned repeatedly throughout her account, his role in protecting her established as critical element. She spoke about her father's involvement, about Kuruk's defection, about Harrison's cavalry, providing protection that civilian authorities had failed to offer. When she finished, silence filled judges' chambers for a long moment, Weatherby processing information that raised questions about jurisdiction and authority. His response when it came carried weight of judicial officer recognizing he was being asked to exercise discretion. The man who ordered your death is himself dead killed during assault on federal witnesses. That complicates prosecution, significantly eliminates primary defendant, while potentially creating liability for people who killed him. The observation addressed exactly the concern Cole had been avoiding. But before he could formulate response, Kuruk spoke from where he had been sitting quietly. I can provide evidence of conspiracy extending beyond Dakota. Council members who enabled his actions, who provided resources and authority that made attempted murder possible. The intervention shifted conversation toward possibility. Cole hadn't fully considered justice might be achievable even without primary perpetrator if supporting cast could be held accountable. Weatherby's expression showed he was calculating rapidly. Harrison added military perspective that further complicated judges' assessment testimony about federal resources committed to protecting witnesses about casualties suffered defending civilians. The discussion continued through afternoon legal and tactical considerations, intersecting in ways that required careful navigation. Eventually, Weatherby called recess, promising ruling the following morning about how case would proceed. Harrison arranged accommodations at boarding house. Elena Martinez operated near courthouse proprietor, who'd apparently protected witnesses before. The rooms were sparse but clean privacy that felt luxurious. Naira had been assigned room adjacent to Cole's proximity that reflected both security concerns and connection that had developed between them. She appeared at his door near evening, knocking softly before entering. I need to ask something before tomorrow, before Judge makes decisions that will determine what happens next. Cole set aside the weapons he'd been cleaning. He gestured for her to sit. Naira settled into chair with care that it suggested her wounds still caused pain. When she spoke, her voice carried vulnerability mixed with determination. What happens after testimony? After case concludes, after whatever justice can be achieved has been achieved. Do you go back to drifting? Do I return to reservation? Do we just separate and pretend past week didn't happen? The questions hit harder than combat, had emotional exposure that felt more dangerous because it demanded honesty about feelings Cole had been deliberately avoiding examining. He considered deflecting, offering non-committal response. But Naira deserved better. I don't know. 5 years I've been running from exactly this kind of attachment, from caring about someone whose survival matters more than my own, from allowing myself to be vulnerable to loss. Part of me wants to leave tomorrow, get back on my horse, and ride somewhere you're not. He paused, recognizing that stopping there would be cowardice. But larger part of me can't imagine being anywhere you're not, can't pretend this past week didn't matter, can't return to isolation that felt safe before I met you, but now just feels like running. I'm terrified of caring about you, terrified that allowing this connection means opening myself to pain. I barely survived last time. But I'm more terrified of not taking risk and spending rest of my life wondering what might have been possible if I'd been braver. Naira absorbed his confession in silence that felt eternal. When she finally spoke, her voice carried matching honesty. I'm afraid too. Afraid you'll leave. Afraid you'll stay for wrong reasons. Afraid what we feel is just trauma bonding that won't survive when crisis passes. But I'm willing to risk being afraid if it means finding out whether this is real. The acknowledgement of mutual fear somehow made risk feel more acceptable. Cole stood crossing the small room to where she sat, his hand finding hers with touch that carried tenderness. Their kiss, when it came, felt inevitable conclusion to conversation that had been building since he'd first cut her down from hanging tree. It carried passion mixed with gentleness, recognition of what they'd survived together and what they were choosing to risk. When they separated, Naira leaned against him with comfort that spoke to trust she'd granted, despite circumstances that should have made such trust impossible. Stay. Not tonight necessarily, not in ways that would feel rushed. But stay in Tucson, stay while I testify, stay while we figure out what happens next. And after, if you still want to leave, if isolation calls stronger than what we're building, then leave knowing I understand. The offer felt simultaneously generous and challenging. Cole found himself nodding before conscious thought fully engaged. I'll stay. Through testimony, through whatever complications follow through, figuring out what this is. Can't promise I'll be good at it, can't guarantee I won't panic and run when things get difficult, but I'll try to stay present. They remained together through evening conversation flowing between comfortable silence and discussions about future that felt more possible. Eventually, Naira returned to her own room, propriety observed, even as deeper intimacy had been acknowledged. Cole slept better that night than he had since finding Naira exhaustion, combining with a something approaching peace to produce rest that actually restored. Dreams that came were gentler than usual, memories of Emma and Sarah that felt less like accusation and more like permission to move forward. Morning brought Judge Weatherby's ruling delivered in formal court session that filled gallery with observers curious about case that had generated speculation throughout Tucson. The judge's decision, when it came, showed he had chosen expansion over limitation. Federal charges would be filed against 7 Apache Council members for conspiracy to commit murder, abuse of authority, violation of civil rights under territorial statutes. The prosecution would be aggressive message sent that even tribal officials faced accountability when they perverted traditional authority. Additionally, Weatherby announced that military investigation into Dakota's death during assault on federal witnesses had been completed, finding justified homicide in defense of hostages and protection of witnesses under military authority. Cole felt relief at that announcement, legal exposure having been formally resolved. The trial itself would come in 3 weeks' time, necessary for prosecution to prepare a comprehensive case and for defendants to organize legal response. But Weatherby's preliminary ruling suggested those challenges would fail, that territorial justice would proceed regardless of procedural objections. Naira would be primary witness, her testimony essential to establishing facts and demonstrating intent. But Kurok's evidence about council deliberations would prove equally important insider perspective that demonstrated conscious decision-making. Cole would testify about finding Naira, about physical evidence of attempted murder, about flight and combat that had followed. His deputy marshal background would lend credibility to observations. The 3 weeks before trial passed in structured routine that felt strange after crisis that had consumed previous 10 days. Cole and Naira spent time together navigating boundaries between professional witness preparation and personal relationship development. Harrison departed after first-week military obligations requiring his return to Fort Bowie. His farewell carried weight of shared experience, soldier and civilian, having faced death together. Manaba remained in Tucson with his daughter's chief, whose presence ensured tribal perspective would be represented during trial. His relationship with Cole evolved from wary alliance towards something approaching mutual respect. The trial, when it finally convened, filled Tucson's federal courthouse to capacity, observers packing gallery to witness proceedings that would establish precedents affecting territorial governance and tribal sovereignty, both. 7 defendants sat with their attorneys, men whose expressions ranged from defiant to fearful. Prosecution opened with compelling narrative about young woman refusing marriage that would have subjected her to control of violent man, about corruption of tribal authority to punish that refusal through attempted murder disguised as legitimate traditional discipline. Naira testified on second day, taking stand with composure that impressed everyone present, delivery that combined emotional authenticity with factual precision. She described Dakota's advances, her refusals escalating, threats that culminated in hanging she'd barely survived. Defense attorneys attempted to undermine her credibility through aggressive cross-examination that suggested she'd misunderstood tribal procedures, that discipline she'd received had been legitimate response to violations of sacred obligations. But Naira held firm, refusing to accept characterizations that blamed her for violence others had inflicted, maintaining dignity that made defense strategy feel cruel. Kurok testified on fourth day insider perspective that prosecutors had been building toward. He described council meetings where Dakota had proposed eliminating Naira, how other defendants had provided resources and authority, how traditional mechanisms meant to ensure justice had been perverted. Defense attempts to discredit Karuk as traitor motivated by personal animosity largely failed, his testimony too detailed and corroborated by documentary evidence to be dismissed as fabrication. Cole testified on sixth-day his law enforcement background, lending weight to observations about physical evidence and tactical decisions. He described finding Naira rope burns and wounds that indicated attempted murder pursuit by forces whose organization demonstrated coordinated operation. Defense attorneys tried to paint him as outsider who'd misunderstood cultural context, white cowboy imposing his values. But Cole's responses focused on facts rather than interpretation, physical evidence that spoke for itself. The trial consumed 3 weeks of testimony and argument. Deliberations lasted 4 days longer than most observers expected, suggesting disagreement among jurors. When verdict finally came, it split difference between prosecution's hope for conviction on all counts and defense's push for complete acquittal. 5 of 7 defendants were convicted on conspiracy charges, sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. 2 defendants were acquitted, evidence apparently insufficient to establish their knowing participation. Naira wept when verdict was announced, tears carrying mixture of relief and exhaustion in recognition that justice had been at least partially achieved even if outcomes weren't perfect. Cole sat beside her in gallery, his hand finding hers support that carried no words because none were necessary. In aftermath of trial, as Tucson absorbed verdict and implications, Cole and Naira faced decisions about what came next. Manaba offered Cole position within tribal community, recognition that his protection of Naira had earned respect. But Cole declined with gratitude, explaining that he needed to build something independent. Instead, he and Naira purchased small ranch outside Tucson land that allowed them to maintain connection to both Apache community and territorial society without being fully subsumed by either. Space where they could define themselves through choices rather than obligations. The ranch became sanctuary where others who'd been cast out or marginalized could find temporary refuge. Sister Catherine sent people who needed protection while healing. Harrison occasionally directed witnesses requiring security. It never grew large or wealthy, but it served purpose that felt meaningful. Years passed with rhythms that frontier life imposed. Cole and Naira married after first-year ceremony that blended Apache traditions with territorial customs. Children came eventually, 3 daughters who grew up hearing stories about how their parents had met, about violence that had nearly prevented their existence, about justice that had been pursued against systems designed to prevent accountability. The girls learned to ride and shoot, to respect both Apache heritage and frontier independence, to understand that strength came from refusing to accept injustice. Cole never fully stopped drifting internally, part of him always remaining unsettled, haunted by Emma and Sarah, in ways that decades couldn't completely resolve. But Naira's presence provided anchor that prevented that drift from becoming dissolution. Sometimes late at night when their daughters slept and ranch was quiet, Cole would stand outside looking at stars overhead, remembering the woman hanging from tree, whom he'd almost ridden past, contemplating the choice that had transformed his life from isolated survival into something larger. He'd saved Naira's life that day in Red Willow Basin, but she'd saved his in return, pulling him from isolation that was slowly killing him, showing him that connection was possible, even after loss, that justice could be pursued even when systems failed. The ranch thrived modestly, existence that felt sufficient for people who'd learned that survival itself was achievement worthy of gratitude. And on quiet evenings when work was done and family gathered together, Cole would catch Naira's eye across the room and see reflected there the same recognition he felt, that they'd found something worth the pain required to claim it. Years later, after Cole had passed in his sleep at 73, after a long life that had been richer than circumstances suggested it should have been, Naira would tell their grandchildren about the cowboy who'd refused to leave, about choices he'd made, despite fear and grief and every rational reason to protect himself. She would explain that courage wasn't absence of fear, but willingness to be afraid while still moving forward, that justice required people refusing to accept injustice, even when systems were designed to perpetuate it, that love meant choosing vulnerability, despite knowing how much it could hurt. And her grandchildren would listen to stories about grandmother, who'd been hanged and survived, about grandfather who'd cut her down and stayed, about justice that had been achieved imperfectly, but meaningfully. The ranch would continue for generations, purpose evolving, but fundamental commitment remaining consistent, providing sanctuary for people who needed protection, pursuing justice when systems failed, refusing to accept that powerful people should face no consequences. And in Tucson's federal courthouse in records that would be preserved long after participants had died, testimony from Naira's trial would establish precedents that future prosecutors would cite when pursuing cases involving abuse of authority, that defense attorneys would reference when protecting clients, that judges would consult when navigating jurisdictional complexities. The innocent should not hang, someone had said during trial, words that became unofficial motto for reforms that followed. Simple principle that felt obvious until circumstances revealed how many people and institutions would compromise it when doing so served their interests. Cole had lived those words without speaking them, had demonstrated through actions that abstract principles meant nothing unless people were willing to sacrifice comfort and safety to defend them. His legacy wasn't the ranch or the children or the years of life he'd built with Naira, though those mattered. His legacy was the choice he'd made to stop when he could have ridden past to stay, when leaving would have been safer, to fight when surrender would have been easier. The story ended where it had begun, with man on horseback, seeing smoke in the distance and choosing to investigate rather than ignore, with simple decision that cascaded into consequences nobody could have predicted, with recognition that individual choices mattered even when systems suggested otherwise. The innocent should not hang. And sometimes when circumstances aligned and people found courage they didn't know they possessed, when strangers chose to become protectors and witnesses refused to be silenced, sometimes the innocent didn't hang. Sometimes they survived, testified, built lives that honored what they'd endured by refusing to let it define them completely. That was Cole Brennan's legacy. That was Naira's victory. That was the story that needed telling, the truth that needed preserving, the memory that would outlast them both, because some stories were too important to let fade. And in Red Willow Basin, where it had all started, where trees still stood, that had nearly been Naira's execution site, travelers would sometimes stop and wonder about the place. Local residents who knew the story would tell it to those who asked, keeping memory alive through oral tradition, ensuring that lesson wouldn't be forgotten. Some said on quiet nights you could still hear the rope creaking, the sound of woman refusing to die, the echo of horse approaching and stopping, because rider couldn't ignore suffering he witnessed. Stories grew in telling, embellishment, making events seem more dramatic. But core truth remained intact, that choice mattered, that courage could be found when circumstances demanded it, that justice was achievable when people refused to accept its absence as inevitable. The sun set over the ranch one final evening, in the story casting long shadows across land that had been sanctuary for dozens who'd passed through seeking refuge. Light that illuminated tombstone bearing Cole's name beside the space that would eventually hold Naira's. Their daughters stood together watching darkness arrive, three women who'd been raised on stories about bravery and sacrifice, who'd learned through example that legacy was built through daily choices. And somewhere in the distance, a lone rider crossed the ridge, silhouette against dying light, stranger moving through landscape that held stories they didn't know. Maybe they'd stop to help if they saw someone in the trouble. Maybe they'd keep riding. Maybe their choice would cascade into consequences they couldn't predict. The story ended there, with possibility rather than certainty, with recognition that every generation faced similar choices. The question wasn't whether injustice would arise, but whether people would respond when they encountered it, whether strangers would become protectors, whether witnesses would find courage to testify, whether justice could be achieved despite systems designed to prevent it. Cole Brennan had answered that question through his choices. Naira had answered it through her survival and testimony. And everyone who'd stood with them, from Harrison to Manaba to Sister Catherine to countless others, they'd all answered the same question with their commitment to something larger than individual survival. The story lived on, carried forward by people who understood that some truths couldn't be forgotten without losing something essential about what it meant to be human, what it meant to choose courage over convenience, what it meant to pursue justice even when pursuit required risking everything familiar and safe. And that ultimately was all any story could hope to achieve: preservation of truth that mattered, example that inspired, legacy that outlasted the individuals who'd created it, through choices that transformed them from ordinary people into something extraordinary, simply by refusing to accept that ordinary decency was beyond their capability when circumstances demanded more. The innocent should not hang. And sometimes when people chose to act rather than ignore, when courage overcame fear, When justice mattered more than convenience, sometimes they didn't. The wind carried that truth across Red Willow Basin, across San Rafael, across Tucson, and every settlement where the story had touched lives and changed outcomes. It whispered through the branches of the hanging tree, through the walls of Sister Catherine's clinic, through the halls of the courthouse where justice had been imperfectly but meaningfully served. And in all those places, in all those moments, the echo remained the sound of one man choosing to stop, instead of riding past the sound of one woman choosing to testify, instead of accepting silence, the sound of justice being pursued by people who refused to believe it was impossible just because systems said it was. That sound would carry forward generation after generation, a reminder that individual choices created ripples that extended far beyond immediate circumstances, that courage was contagious, that justice was achievable when enough people committed themselves to achieving it. The story of Cole Brennan and Naira was one story among thousands, one moment among millions, when someone chose differently, when circumstances that seemed designed to produce tragedy instead produced triumph through stubborn refusal to accept that tragedy was inevitable. But it was a story worth preserving, worth telling, worth remembering, because stories like these were the foundation upon which societies that valued justice were built. The evidence that systems could be made to work when people demanded they work. The proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when necessity demanded and conscience refused to accept alternatives. The ranch stood testament to that truth, generations of family carrying forward mission that had begun with desperate flight and imperfect justice, and two people finding connection in midst of crisis. The land itself seemed to remember soil enriched by choices made decades earlier, foundations built on principle rather than convenience. And when the last light finally faded over Red Willow Basin, when stars emerged one by one to illuminate the landscape where everything had begun, the story remained carried in memory, preserved in records, lived through descendants who understood that their existence was itself testament to choices their ancestors had made when easier paths beckoned. The hanging tree still stood weathered by years, but unbroken, silent witness to moment when death had been averted through intervention that shouldn't have happened, but did. And in that silence lived the possibility that it could happen again, that next time someone faced injustice, someone else might choose to intervene, that systems designed to fail, certain people might be forced to function properly through sufficient courage and sufficient commitment. That was the legacy. That was the truth. That was why the story mattered and would continue mattering long after everyone involved had returned to Earth that had briefly supported their struggles and witnessed their triumphs. The innocent should not hang. Simple words, profound truth, eternal challenge to every generation that followed. Would they honor that principle or abandon it when maintaining it became inconvenient? Would they be people who rode past or people who stopped? Would they accept injustice as inevitable or fight it as intolerable? Cole Brennan had answered. Naira had answered. And their answer echoed forward through time, invitation and challenge, both calling to anyone who heard the story to consider how they would answer when their moment came, when choice presented itself between safety and justice, between convenience and courage, between riding past and stopping to help. The story lived because it needed to live, because the questions it posed were eternal, because every generation faced similar choices, even if circumstances differed. And as long as those questions remained relevant, as long as justice remained, something that had to be fought for rather than something that arrived automatically, the story of the hanging tree would endure reminder, warning, inspiration proof that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they chose courage over comfort and justice over convenience. And that was enough. That was everything. That was the point where story transformed from historical record into living truth, from past event into present challenge, from their legacy into our responsibility. The innocent should not hang. The rest was up to those who heard the story and chose what to do with it.